Hey everyone, welcome back to another Minecraft session where we dig into some truly wild stories from the internet. Today we're talking about someone who discovered their boyfriend wasn't just cheating, he was running an entire operation with 4 girlfriends and 7 side chicks. Before we jump into everything, the support lately has been unreal. I didn't expect this many people to show up, leave comments, and show love. Seriously, thank you. It means a lot. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We're on the road to 1,000 subs, and I'd love to reach it together. So, our story starts with a simple suspicion, the kind that most people brush off because they don't want to believe the worst. But sometimes that gut feeling exists for a reason. What started as one questionable text message was about to reveal something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. I should have trusted my gut the first time I saw that text notification light up his screen while he was in the shower. It was from someone named Becca, with a heart emoji next to her name, saying she missed him and couldn't wait for their weekend trip. The thing is, I was supposed to be going on that weekend trip with him. He'd told me it was a work conference in Atlanta, said I'd be bored out of my mind sitting through insurance seminars all day. I'd believed him because why wouldn't I? Marcus had always been the reliable one, the guy who remembered anniversaries and brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. But that text sat wrong with me. It festered in the back of my mind for 3 days until I couldn't take it anymore. When he left for his morning run, I went looking for that second phone I'd convinced myself I'd imagined. Found it in a gym bag he never used, tucked inside an old sneaker like some kind of terrible cliche. The phone wasn't even locked. That's how confident he was that he'd never get caught. I opened it and my stomach dropped through the floor. There were 4 separate text threads with women who all called him baby, all had plans with him, all thought they were his girlfriend. Sarah thought they were exclusive and had been dating for 8 months. Jessica had just celebrated their 1 year anniversary last week. Becca was planning to introduce him to her parents next month. And then there was Amber, who'd apparently just moved across town to be closer to him. 8 months, 1 year. These weren't flings, these were full relationships, running parallel to ours, and he was juggling all of them like some kind of sociopathic circus performer. That wasn't even the worst part. Below those 4 main threads were 7 other conversations, women he was clearly stringing along with just enough attention to keep them interested. Late night texts, occasional meetups, promises of something more serious once his life calmed down. He had a different story for each of them. Told one he was divorced and working through trust issues. Told another he traveled constantly for work. Told a third he was taking care of a sick parent and couldn't commit fully yet. Every single lie was carefully crafted, tailored to what each woman would accept. I sat on our bedroom floor with that phone in my hands for probably 20 minutes, just scrolling, watching 2 years of my life recontextualize itself. Every business trip, every guy's night, every time he'd been too tired for dinner or said he had to work late. It had all been her, them, all of them. The man I'd been planning a future with had built an empire of deception so elaborate it should have required a flowchart. Here's where it gets absurd. I could have just left, packed my stuff, ghosted him, moved on with my life. But something inside me snapped. These women deserved to know. They deserved to understand that the man they trusted, the one who'd made them feel special and chosen, was feeding them the same lines he'd fed me. So I did something that probably sounds insane, but felt absolutely necessary in the moment. I created a group chat. I added all 11 phone numbers, every woman from that burner phone, and I introduced myself. Hi, I'm Marcus's girlfriend of 2 years, or at least I thought I was. Attached below are screenshots from his second phone. I think we all need to talk. Then I started uploading every conversation, every promise he'd made, every lie he'd told each of us about where he was and who he was with. I watched the read receipts pile up, watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear as these women processed what they were seeing. The chaos that followed was something I'll never forget. The group chat exploded. Sarah was crying, sending voice messages about how she'd turned down a job opportunity in another state to stay close to him. Jessica revealed she'd loaned him $5,000 for what he said was a family emergency, money she now realized probably funded his dates with other women. Amber had just signed a year lease on an apartment in his neighborhood. These weren't just broken hearts. These were shattered lives, redirected futures, real consequences built on his foundation of lies. And the 7 side chicks, they started comparing notes too. Turns out he'd been rotating through them on a schedule, seeing each one just often enough to keep them hoping for more. One of them, Katie, had been waiting for him to commit for almost 2 years, believing his story about needing time to heal from a bad divorce that I now knew never happened because Marcus had never been married. The women thanked me, every single one of them. They were devastated, destroyed, but grateful to finally understand why something had always felt slightly off, why he was never quite available in the way they needed, why there were always excuses and last-minute cancellations. I'd given them the truth, and as painful as it was, truth beats living in a beautifully constructed lie. Marcus came home from his run to find me sitting on the couch with both phones on the coffee table in front of me. The look on his face when he saw that burner phone sitting there was almost worth the heartbreak. He went pale, then red, then started stammering about how I'd invaded his privacy, how I had no right to go through his things, how I was overreacting. Overreacting. The man had 4 girlfriends, and he thought I was overreacting. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just told him to get out. Told him I'd already contacted every woman he'd been lying to, that they all knew now, and that if he wasn't out of the apartment in an hour, I'd start making calls to his family and his job. He tried the apology route then. The tears and the I can explain, and the you're the only one I really love. But I was done. I'd heard him use those exact words in text to Jessica just 3 days ago. He left, took his gym bag and his burner phone, and walked out the door, probably already trying to calculate which relationship he could salvage, which lies he could still maintain. But he'd underestimated how connected we'd all become. That group chat turned into a support system. We shared stories, compared timelines, helped each other heal, and we decided collectively that Marcus needed to face real consequences. His friends started calling me vindictive when word got out. His college buddies, his gym bros, they all painted me as the crazy ex who couldn't let go, who was on some kind of revenge mission. They said I should have just broken up with him quietly. That publicly humiliating him was cruel and unnecessary. These were the same guys who'd probably known what he was doing, who'd covered for him, who'd watched him lie to my face and said nothing. Then came the breaking point. Marcus went on social media with his own version of events, posted this long, carefully worded statement about how he'd been struggling with commitment issues and mental health, how he'd made mistakes but was seeking help, how his crazy ex-girlfriend had violated his privacy and was now harassing him and the women he'd dated. He positioned himself as the victim, the misunderstood guy dealing with a vindictive woman who couldn't accept that the relationship was over. His comments filled up with supportive messages from people who didn't know the full story, telling him to stay strong, calling me toxic. And just as I was about to hit post on that final evidence dump, my hands were literally shaking. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're as addicted to Reddit drama as I am. Make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. I need to know I'm not alone in this madness. Anyway, back to Marcus's complete meltdown. I posted everything, created a public album with screenshots of his conversations with all 11 women, a timeline showing how he juggled us all, screenshots of his lies to each of us. I included his social media post claiming to be the victim and put it side by side with messages where he'd told Sarah he loved her while texting Jessica about their anniversary plans while asking me to move in with him. All on the same day. I didn't editorialize, didn't add commentary. Just let the evidence speak for itself and tagged him so everyone who'd seen his victim post would see the truth. The response was immediate and brutal. His comment section turned from supportive to absolutely scathing within hours. People he'd known since high school were asking how they'd never seen this side of him. His sister called him out publicly for lying to the family about having a serious girlfriend when he'd apparently had 5. His friends went quiet, either from shame at defending him or from realizing they'd been manipulated too. But here's where it really hit him. His job found out. Someone from his office saw the posts and forwarded them to HR, probably because he'd been claiming work trips that didn't exist, using the company as an alibi for his lies. They launched an investigation into his expense reports and found he'd been billing personal travel as business expenses. The weekend trips with Sarah and Becca and the others. He'd been getting reimbursed for hotels and meals by his company, claiming they were client meetings. He was fired within the week. His family found out the full extent of everything. His mum called me, actually apologized for raising someone capable of this. said she'd always thought I was the perfect match for him and was devastated to learn what he'd done. His dad apparently told him not to come to family dinner until he got his life together. Even his younger brother, who'd looked up to Marcus his whole life, stopped talking to him. The perfect reputation Marcus had spent years building. The good guy image he'd maintained while secretly being the worst kind of liar. It all shattered overnight. The same social media presence he'd used to paint himself as a victim became a permanent record of his manipulation. Every time someone Googled his name, my post came up. Every future relationship he tried to start would eventually lead back to this. He'd built his own prison out of lies, and I'd just given everyone the key. Last I heard, he'd moved back in with his parents in another state, deleted all his social media, and was apparently in therapy. I hope he actually works on himself. I hope he figures out whatever broken part of him thought this was okay and fixes it. But that's not my problem anymore. I got my life back, helped 11 other women dodge years of wasted time, and learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate or clever. Sometimes it's just the truth, served cold and with receipts. But Marcus wasn't the only one living a double life, and what happened next makes his situation look almost amateur. I thought I knew my wife. I really did. Sarah and I had been married for 5 years, and every summer she took this girls' trip with her college friends. Miami, usually. Cocktails by the pool, spa days, the whole thing. She'd send me photos throughout the weekend, her and the girls laughing on the beach, sunset selfies. You know the drill. I never questioned it. Why would I? We had a good marriage. Or at least I thought we did. This year started the same way. Sarah packed her bags on a Thursday morning, kissed me goodbye, and told me she'd be back Sunday night. Her friends picked her up around 10, and off they went. I settled in for a quiet weekend, maybe catch up on some work, play some video games, the usual bachelor routine when your wife's out of town. Friday afternoon, I'm scrolling through Instagram when I see Emma's story. Emma's one of Sarah's best friends from college. Been on every girl's trip since they started doing them. She posted a photo of the group clinking glasses, caption saying something about making memories. Cute. Normal. Except when I tapped through, I noticed the location tag. Not Miami. Not even close to Miami. It was tagged at some lake house about 3 hours north of where we live. At first, I figured it was a mistake. Maybe Emma's phone glitched, tagged the wrong location, something technical. But then I kept looking at the photo. The background didn't look tropical. No palm trees, no ocean view. It looked like a cabin. Wood paneling, a stone fireplace in the background. Definitely not Miami. I tried calling Sarah, straight to voicemail. I texted her asking how Miami was. No response. That weird feeling started creeping in. The kind you get when something's just off, but you can't put your finger on it exactly. I spent the next hour doing something I'm not proud of. I went full detective mode. I searched the location Emma had tagged, found the lake house rental property, cross-referenced it with Sarah's location history on our shared phone plan. And there it was. Her phone had been pinging from that area since yesterday. Not Miami. A lake house 3 hours away that she'd apparently lied about. The thing is, I'm not usually the suspicious type. I don't check up on Sarah, don't go through her phone, none of that. We trusted each other. Or again, I thought we did. But this felt wrong enough that I couldn't just let it go. I grabbed my keys and started driving. The whole way there, I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe they changed plans last minute. Maybe it was a surprise for one of the girls, and Sarah couldn't tell me. I was grasping at anything that made sense. The GPS led me down this winding road surrounded by trees, and then I saw it. The lake house from Emma's photo, and parked out front, 4 cars I didn't recognize and one I absolutely did. A silver Honda Accord with a dent in the back bumper and a university parking sticker I'd seen 1,000 times before. It belonged to Jake, Sarah's ex-boyfriend. My stomach dropped. Sarah had dated Jake for 3 years before we met. She told me they'd ended things amicably but hadn't stayed in touch. She said it was cleaner that way, easier to move on. I'd never questioned it. Why would she lie about something like that? I sat in my car for maybe 10 minutes, just staring at that Honda, trying to process what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, pretend I'd never seen any of this. But I couldn't. I had to know. I walked up to the front door and heard voices inside. Laughter, music playing softly. It sounded like a party. I didn't knock, I just opened the door. The entire room went silent. There must have been 15 people inside. Sarah was standing near the kitchen island holding a glass of wine. Emma and the other girls from the trip were scattered around the room. And then there was Jake, sitting on the couch. His parents were there too. I recognized them from old photos Sarah had shown me years ago. There were kids running around, maybe 5 or 6 years old, playing with toys on the floor. It looked like a family reunion, because that's exactly what it was. Sarah's face went completely white when she saw me. She set down her wine glass so fast it nearly tipped over. Jake stood up from the couch. His mom, who'd been mid-sentence when I walked in, just froze with her mouth open. Nobody said anything for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then Sarah finally spoke. Her voice came out shaky, almost a whisper. She said my name like a question, like she couldn't believe I was actually standing there. I asked her what was going on. Simple question. She didn't answer right away. She looked at Emma, then at Jake, then back at me. She said it wasn't what it looked like, which is the most cliché thing you can say when you're caught doing something you shouldn't be doing. I asked again, what was going on? Why was she here? Why did she lie about Miami? Jake's dad cleared his throat and said maybe they should give us some privacy. But before anyone could move, Jake's mum, bless her completely oblivious heart, tried to salvage the situation. She walked over with this big smile and introduced herself to me, like we were at a garden party. She said she was so glad to finally meet Sarah's husband, that Sarah had told them so much about me. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said it was wonderful that Sarah still made time for their family, that she'd always be like a daughter to them, that they treasured these gatherings with her. Treasured these gatherings, plural, as in this wasn't the first time. I looked at Sarah. I asked how long this had been going on. She didn't answer. Emma tried to step in, said maybe we should talk about this later, but I wasn't leaving without answers. Jake finally spoke up. He said they'd stayed friends, that Sarah came to family events sometimes, that it was all completely innocent. Innocent, right. So innocent that my wife had been lying to me for years about girls' trips to Miami when she was actually attending her ex-boyfriend's family reunions. That's when everything unraveled. Sarah started crying. She said she didn't know how to tell me, that she knew I wouldn't understand. She said Jake's family had been so important to her, that his mom had helped her through some really difficult times in college, that she couldn't just cut them off completely when they broke up. I asked her how many times, how many trips had actually been here instead of Miami. She hesitated, then she said most of them. For the last 2 years, 2 entire years of elaborate lies, fake beach photos, probably coordinated with Emma and the other girls to keep the story straight, all so she could maintain this secret relationship with her ex's family. But that wasn't even the worst part. Jake's mum, clearly reading the room completely wrong, decided this was the moment to give a toast. She raised her glass and started talking about how special Sarah was, how Jake had been so lucky to have her, how she'd always been the one that got away. The one that got away. She said it right in front of me. Sarah's husband, the man Sarah had actually married, and based on the way Sarah looked at the floor instead of correcting her, this wasn't the first time she'd heard that particular phrase. I didn't yell, I didn't make a scene, I just looked at Sarah and told her we were done, that I'd have divorce papers drawn up by the end of the week. Then I turned around and walked out. Sarah followed me to the car, crying, begging me to wait, to let her explain. But what was there to explain? She'd been living a double life, lying to me constantly, maintaining this weird emotional connection to her ex and his family, while pretending to me that it didn't exist. The drive home was a blur. I don't really remember most of it. I just kept replaying Jake's mum's words, the one that got away. Like I was some consolation prize, like Sarah had settled for me because she couldn't have what she really wanted. When I got home, I called a lawyer, filed for divorce on Monday. Sarah tried to fight it at first, said I was overreacting, that nothing physical had happened with Jake, like that was the point, like the lying wasn't enough on its own. The fallout was immediate. Emma and the other girls who'd covered for Sarah, their partners found out they'd been lying too. Turns out when you help your friend maintain a secret relationship with her ex's family, your own relationship tends to suffer. 3 of them ended up in couples therapy. One of them got divorced too. Sarah moved out within 2 weeks. She tried to explain herself a few more times, sent me long emails about how she'd made a mistake, how she'd never meant to hurt me. But here's the thing, you don't accidentally lie to someone for 2 years. You don't accidentally post fake beach photos to cover your tracks. That takes planning, intention, a conscious choice every single time. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. I heard through mutual friends that Sarah's still close with Jake's family, that she goes to their events openly now. Good for her, I guess. At least she doesn't have to lie anymore. As for me, I'm doing okay. Better than okay, actually. I started going to therapy, worked through the trust issues, figured out what I actually want in a relationship. Turns out being someone's first choice matters more than I thought. Speaking of relationships built on recycled lies, one bride discovered her wedding vows weren't even original. I thought I knew Derek pretty well. We'd been together for 3 years, engaged for 6 months, and honestly, I was counting down the days until our wedding. Everything felt perfect. Maybe that should have been my first warning sign, because perfect doesn't really exist, does it? But I was too busy being happy to notice the cracks forming underneath. 2 weeks before the big day, I was looking for a poem Derek had mentioned wanting to include in our ceremony. He told me about it during one of those late-night conversations where you're both half asleep and saying sweet things you'll barely remember in the morning. I figured I'd surprise him by finding it and working it into my vows somehow. So I did what any trusting fiancé would do. I opened his laptop, went into his email, and started searching. What I found instead was a Google Doc titled Wedding Vows Final Draft. My heart actually skipped a beat in excitement. I thought maybe he'd been working on his vows, and I could sneak a peek, get a sense of what he was planning to say. I know, it's supposed to be a surprise, but I couldn't help myself. I opened it, already smiling at the thought of reading his promises to me. Except the document was dated 8 months ago, and it wasn't addressed to me. It was sent to someone named Michelle. I sat there staring at the screen, my brain trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was an ex. Maybe these were old vows from a previous relationship that didn't work out. But the date didn't make sense. 8 months ago, Derek and I were already together. We were already talking about getting engaged. And then I started reading the actual content, and my stomach dropped. You're my forever, my always, the person I choose every single day. That line, that exact line. Derek had said that to me last week when we were reviewing our ceremony timeline. He'd gotten all emotional, held my hands, looked into my eyes, and said those words like they were coming straight from his soul. I remembered tearing up because it felt so genuine, so perfectly him. But here it was, word for word, written to someone named Michelle, 8 months before he'd said it to me. I kept scrolling. Every metaphor, every promise, every supposedly heartfelt sentiment he'd shared with me over the past few weeks as we prepared for the wedding, it was all there. Copy and pasted, recycled. Like he'd just found a template online and decided to reuse it because why waste good material, right? The poem I'd been looking for? Yeah, that was in there too. Turns out it wasn't some obscure piece of literature he'd stumbled across. It was something he'd written himself, for Michelle, and then served to me like it was fresh. I closed the laptop. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I think I was too shocked to cry. Instead, I did what any rational person discovering their fiancé might be living a double life would do. I called a private investigator, and yes, I know how dramatic that sounds, but at that point, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I confronted him. The PI got back to me within 3 days. Michelle was real, very real. She lived in Oregon, about 2 states away from us. And here's the part that made me physically ill. Derek was engaged to her too. Not like previously engaged and they broke up. Currently engaged. She had a ring, she had a wedding date, she had a fiancé named Derek who traveled for work a lot, which explained why he could maintain 2 separate lives without either of us catching on. Her wedding was scheduled for 3 months after ours. The PI sent me screenshots of her social media. There were photos of her and Derek together, date stamped from times when he told me he was visiting his sick aunt or attending a work conference. She posted about their engagement 6 weeks before he proposed to me, which meant he'd bought 2 rings, gotten down on one knee twice, and somehow managed to keep both relationships running simultaneously. I felt like I was watching my life implode in slow motion. Every memory I had with Derek was suddenly tainted. Every trip he took, every late night work call, every time he said he loved me, it all felt like a performance now. And the worst part? I'd believed every second of it. I needed to talk to Michelle, not to compare notes in some weird competitive way, but because she deserved to know what was happening just as much as I did. The PI helped me find her contact information, and I sent her a carefully worded email explaining who I was and what I'd discovered. I attached screenshots, including the vows, document, and photos of Derek and me together, with timestamps that overlapped with their relationship. She responded within an hour. One line, "Can we talk on the phone?" That conversation lasted 3 hours. Michelle was devastated, but she was also angry, which I appreciated because anger is easier to work with than sadness. We compared our timelines, and the picture that emerged was honestly impressive in its complexity. Derek had basically structured his entire life around maintaining two relationships. He'd told Michelle he worked remotely, which gave him flexibility to travel. He'd told me he had to travel frequently for client meetings. He'd created a whole system of lies that intersected perfectly. And if I hadn't been looking for that stupid poem, I might never have found out until it was too late. Michelle had been with him longer. She'd gotten the first proposal. In some twisted way, I was the other woman, except I hadn't known it. We both felt betrayed, manipulated, and frankly, insulted that he thought he could pull this off. But here's the thing about shared trauma. It bonds people fast. Michelle and I went from strangers to allies in the span of that phone call, and that's when we started planning. Derek had a final walkthrough scheduled at our wedding venue in 5 days. The coordinator wanted to go over last-minute details, finalize the floor plan, that kind of thing. I was supposed to be there with him, but I told him I had a work thing and couldn't make it. He seemed relieved, actually, which should have been another red flag I'd missed along the way. Michelle flew in the night before. We met in person for the first time at a coffee shop near the venue, and it was surreal. We looked nothing alike, which made me wonder if Derek even had a type, or if he just went for whoever would believe his lies. But we got along surprisingly well. Considering the circumstances, we even laughed a few times, that kind of hysterical laughter that happens when a situation is so absurd you can't process it any other way. The plan was simple. We'd both show up to the walkthrough, together, holding hands even, because the visual would make it impossible for Derek to talk his way out of. We'd each wear our engagement rings where he could see them, and we'd let him try to explain himself in front of the wedding coordinator, who'd been working with us for months and thought Derek was this devoted, loving fiancé. The day of the walkthrough, Michelle and I arrived early. We parked in the back and waited until we saw Derek's car pull up. Then we walked in through the main entrance, timed perfectly so we'd cross paths with him in the lobby. The look on his face when he saw us was worth every second of heartbreak I'd felt over the past week. His expression went through about 5 different emotions in 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, panic, and then this weird attempt at a smile like maybe he could charm his way out of it. Michelle and I just stood there, arms linked, matching rings catching the light. The wedding coordinator looked between the three of us, clearly confused. "Oh, I didn't realize we were having extra guests today." She looked at me. "I thought you had a work conflict." "Plans changed," I said. "Turns out I had something more important to handle. I'd like you to meet Michelle. She's Derek's other fiancée." You could actually see the coordinator's brain short-circuit. She looked at Derek, waiting for him to laugh it off or explain that this was some kind of joke. But Derek just stood there, frozen. Michelle spoke next, her voice calm and steady. We compared notes, timelines, photos, even the wedding vows he wrote. Same ones for both of us, by the way. Very efficient. I have to give Derek credit for one thing. He actually tried to spin it. Started stammering something about how this was a misunderstanding, how Michelle was an ex who couldn't let go, how I was being dramatic. But the coordinator cut him off. She'd worked with us long enough to know our story, our relationship history, and she wasn't buying what he was selling. "I think," she said slowly, "we need to cancel this booking." "Both bookings," Michelle added. "He's got one scheduled here for 3 months from now under a different name. You might want to check your system." The coordinator excused herself to make some calls, leaving the 3 of us standing in that lobby. Derek finally found his voice, but instead of apologizing or showing any remorse, he got defensive. started accusing us of conspiring against him, of ruining his life, of being unable to understand what he was going through. It was textbook narcissist behavior, and honestly, it made walking away easier. Michelle and I didn't even respond. We just turned and left, got in my car, and drove to the nearest bar where we proceeded to drink wine and draft a joint statement explaining what had happened. We kept it factual, not vindictive, just the truth. We sent it to everyone in Derek's life: friends, family, co-workers, the whole network. Within hours, his carefully constructed world collapsed. His family called him in shock, friends started taking sides, and most of them sided with us once they heard the full story. His job found out because apparently maintaining two separate lives and traveling constantly for fake reasons had involved some creative expense reports. Derek went from having 2 fiancées and 2 weddings to having nothing in the span of about 48 hours. Michelle and I stayed friends. We joked sometimes about how we should send Derek a thank you card for being such a spectacular disaster that we found each other. Neither of us has spoken to him since that day in the venue. Last I heard, he moved to a different state and deleted all his social media. And those recycled vows he was so proud of, I hope he saved them. He's going to need all the help he can get if he ever tries to convince someone else to marry him. At least those vows were just copied. One person discovered their entire relationship was the knockoff version. I never thought I was the controlling type. Honestly, I barely asked Jen where she was going most of the time, but apparently wanting to know if she'd be home for dinner or asking what her plans were for the weekend made me suffocating. She'd roll her eyes whenever I'd text, asking if she wanted me to pick anything up from the store, like I was interrogating her instead of just trying to be thoughtful. After about 6 months of this, I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I was too clingy. Maybe I needed to give her more space. Maybe the problem really was me. So I backed off, stopped asking questions, stopped trying to make plans more than a day in advance. If she said she was going out, I'd just say, okay, and leave it at that. And you know what? She seemed happier, less defensive. I figured we'd turned a corner, that giving her breathing room had fixed whatever tension had been building between us. Looking back now, I realized she was happy because I'd made her double life significantly easier to maintain. The truth came knocking on my door on a random Tuesday afternoon. I was working from home on a video call actually, when someone started pounding on the apartment door. Not knocking, pounding. I muted myself and went to check, half expecting it to be a neighbor with an emergency or maybe a delivery guy who had the wrong address. Instead, I opened the door to find this guy I'd never seen before, mid-20s, looking equal parts confused and angry. He asked if Jen was home, just like that. Is Jen home? I told him no, she was at her sister's place helping with some family thing, which is what she told me that morning. And this guy, his face did something I'll never forget. It went from angry to absolutely bewildered, like I just told him the sky was green. He asked who I was, I said I was her boyfriend, and asked who he was. And he said, I'm her boyfriend. The awkward silence that followed probably lasted 3 seconds, but felt like an hour. We just stared at each other, both trying to process what the other had just said. Finally, I invited him in because what else do you do in that situation? Leave him standing in the hallway? My video call was still running, so I quickly made an excuse about a family emergency and logged off. Then Tyler, that was his name, and I sat down in my living room and started comparing notes. He'd been dating Jen for 14 months. I'd been with her for 18. He thought they were exclusive. I thought we were exclusive. He'd met her at a coffee shop near his work. I'd met her through mutual friends at a birthday party. She told him she worked in marketing and traveled sometimes for client meetings. She told me she worked in event planning and had irregular hours. Neither of those things were true. She actually worked part-time at a gym doing admin stuff, which explained how she had so much flexibility in her schedule. But that wasn't even the worst part. As we kept talking, pulling out our phones to show each other text conversations and photos, we realized she'd been telling both of us the same lie about the other. She told Tyler she had a controlling ex-boyfriend who wouldn't leave her alone, someone who'd show up at her place sometimes and cause scenes, which is why he couldn't come over without calling first. She told me basically the same thing, that she had an ex who was still kind of in the picture because they shared a friend group, and it was complicated but she was handling it. The ex she'd described to both of us didn't exist. We were the exes. We were each other's villain in the story she'd created. Every time she'd called me controlling for asking simple questions, She was building a narrative she could use to explain away any slip-ups to Tyler. Every time she told him about her difficult ex, she was creating cover for the life she had with me. Tyler pulled up her Instagram, and I didn't recognize it. Different handle, different photos, different everything. She had 2 accounts, one for her life with him, one for her life with me. Different friend groups commented on each. Different life events were posted to each. She'd literally constructed 2 separate identities, and she'd been maintaining both for over a year. Here's where it gets absurd. We started going through calendars trying to figure out the logistics of how she'd pulled this off. Turns out her sister's house that she was supposedly at right now, that's where she told Tyler she was when she stayed with me. Her friend's place that she crashed at sometimes when she said she needed space, that was Tyler's apartment. The work trips were weekends with whichever one of us she wasn't currently with. She had a rotation, a literal schedule. Weeknights with me, weekends with him, except when she'd flip it and claim she needed alone time or had family obligations. The worst part is how good she'd gotten at it. Neither of us had suspected anything. Sure, I'd thought she was a bit distant sometimes, and yeah, the controlling accusations had stung, but I'd never imagined this. Tyler said the same thing. He'd noticed she was protective of her phone and sometimes seemed distracted, but he'd figured that was just her personality. We'd both been too trusting to see what was right in front of us. We decided to wait for her together. Tyler cancelled his plans. I cancelled mine. We ordered pizza and just sat there in my living room. 2 guys who'd been played by the same person, waiting for her to come home and face what she'd done. It felt surreal, like we were in some bad comedy sketch, except nothing about it was funny. She walked in around 7, using her key like always, calling out that she was home. Then she rounded the corner into the living room and froze. I watched her face cycle through every emotion. Confusion at seeing Tyler in my apartment, fear when she realized what that meant, and then, somehow, anger, like we'd wronged her by figuring it out. Tyler spoke first, asked her how long she thought she could keep this up, and Jen, instead of apologizing or explaining or breaking down, she went on the attack, started accusing us of conspiring against her, of invading her privacy, of being controlling and manipulative, said we had no right to compare notes about her, that her relationships were her business, that we were both toxic for ganging up on her like this. The gaslighting was impressive in how shameless it was. She actually tried to convince us that we were the problem, that wanting honesty and exclusivity in a relationship was somehow unreasonable, that she'd been the victim all along, trapped between 2 controlling men who wouldn't give her space to figure out her feelings. Tyler and I just looked at each other, and I think we both realized at the same moment that there was no point in arguing with her. You can't reason with someone who's rewriting reality in real time. So we told her together that it was over. Both of us. Done. She needed to pack her things and leave. She tried the tears then, the I can explain and I never meant to hurt anyone, and I was confused routine, but we'd already made up our minds. Tyler even helped her pack, which was darkly hilarious. The 2 boyfriends she'd been juggling, working together to help her move out of one of their apartments. She kept trying different angles, apologizing, then blaming, then apologizing again, saying she loved us both and couldn't choose, saying she'd been scared of commitment, saying we'd never understand what she was going through. It was like watching someone throw every excuse at the wall to see what stuck. Nothing did. This is where patience finally snapped. After she left, Tyler and I did something that probably sounds petty, but felt absolutely necessary. We each posted about what had happened on social media. Not a rant, not an emotional meltdown, just the facts. Tagged the mutual friends from both groups. Explained the timeline, the lies, the 2 separate lives she'd been living. We didn't trash her or call her names. We just told the truth. The response was immediate. People from both friend groups started connecting the dots, realizing they'd never seen Tyler and me at the same events, understanding why Jen had always kept certain people separate. Some of her friends tried to defend her at first, saying we were being cruel for publicly humiliating her. But then more details came out. Turns out Tyler and I weren't the only ones. There was a 3rd guy she'd been seeing casually, telling him she wasn't ready for anything serious while maintaining full relationships with both of us. Jen deleted both her Instagram accounts within 24 hours, blocked both of us on everything. We heard through mutual friends that she'd moved back in with her parents and was telling people she'd been overwhelmed by work stress and made some bad decisions. Work stress, like accidentally maintaining two complete separate relationships for over a year, is something that just happens when you're busy. The strangest part of all of this, Tyler and I actually became friends. Real friends. We'd bonded over the shared trauma of being lied to so thoroughly, and we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. We still meet up for drinks sometimes, and we always joke that at least something good came out of the disaster. He's a solid guy. We talk about normal stuff now, not just the Jen situation, but it's funny how a relationship built on mutual betrayal turned into one of the more honest friendships I have. Last I heard, Jen was seeing someone new. I hope for his sake she's figured herself out, that maybe the public fallout taught her something about honesty and consequences. But I'm not holding my breath. Some people are just wired differently, and the mental gymnastics required to maintain that level of deception for that long aren't something you just grow out of. Looking back, all those accusations about me being controlling? Pure projection. She was managing two entire relationships, monitoring every story to make sure they didn't overlap, tracking every lie to keep them consistent. If anyone was controlling, it was her. Controlling the narrative so completely that two grown men had no idea they were living the same life with different scheduling. The irony would be funny if it hadn't wasted a year and a half of my life. Hidden phones seem to be a common thread in these disasters, and the next story proves that dead batteries can be deadly to secrets. Chris had always been attached to his phones, both of them. He had his regular phone, the one he used around me, and then his work phone, a sleek black iPhone that he said his company required him to keep separate for security reasons. Made sense at the time. He worked in finance, always talking about NDAs and client confidentiality. I never questioned it. We were having dinner at my parents' house on a Tuesday night. My mum had made her famous lasagna. My dad was telling stories about his latest fishing trip, and everything felt perfectly normal. Chris's work phone was sitting on the table next to his plate, face down like always. Then it died. Just shut off mid-dinner. I didn't think anything of it. I pulled out my charger and offered it to him. You'd use mine, right? Just plug it in over there. The way he reacted, you would have thought I'd suggested he hand over state secrets. He practically lunged across the table, grabbed the phone, and clutched it to his chest. He laughed it off, said the battery was weird and it wouldn't charge properly with other cables, that he'd deal with it later, but his face had gone pale. His hands were shaking slightly as he put the phone in his pocket. My mum noticed. She gave me this look across the table, the kind only mothers can give, the one that says I saw that and you should probably pay attention. My dad kept talking about fishing. Oblivious, but I couldn't focus anymore. That reaction wasn't normal. That was panic. Chris excused himself to use the bathroom about 10 minutes later. He took both phones with him, which should have been my second red flag, but he'd left his jacket on the back of his chair, and in the inside pocket, I could see the corner of that black iPhone. He'd forgotten it. I don't know what possessed me to do it. I'm not usually the snooping type, but that panic in his eyes had lodged itself in my brain and wouldn't let go. So while my parents were in the kitchen getting dessert ready, I pulled out the phone and turned it on. It didn't ask for a passcode, just opened right up to his messages. The most recent conversation was with someone named Baby. Not a name, just Baby with a heart emoji. I opened it and my stomach turned inside out. The messages went back months. Texts about missing each other, about weekend plans, about an apartment they were looking at together. My hands started shaking as I scrolled up. There were photos, Chris and a woman I'd never seen before, his arm around her waist, kissing her cheek, her hand on his chest. They weren't platonic photos, they were couple photos, the kind you take when you're in love. I kept scrolling deeper into the conversation and found messages from 3 weeks ago. The weekend Chris had told me he was visiting his sick aunt in Philadelphia. He'd sent me photos from the hospital waiting room, told me his aunt was doing better, that he wished I could be there, but she was immunocompromised and they weren't allowing visitors. He'd lied. The messages showed he'd been at a bed and breakfast upstate with this woman. They'd gone hiking, had couples massages. He'd sent her photos from the trip. Photos I'd never seen because I'd been home alone, worried about his poor sick aunt who apparently didn't exist. My mum called from the kitchen asking if I wanted coffee with dessert. I answered automatically, not even sure what I said. I couldn't stop reading. And here's where it gets absurd. There was a message from last week. Chris had written about his lease ending next month, about how he couldn't wait to finally make the move. The woman, whose name was apparently Claire based on other messages, had responded asking what he was going to do about the other problem. He'd said, and I quote, "Getting rid of the other problem soon. Don't worry about it." The other problem? He meant me. I was the other problem he planned to get rid of. More messages confirmed it. He was going to ghost me after his lease ended. Just stop responding to texts, block my number, disappear. He'd already started moving his stuff to Claire's place gradually so I wouldn't notice. He'd told her about me, called me clingy and dramatic, said I'd probably cause a scene, but he'd handle it. I sat there at my parents' dining room table, holding this phone, reading about how my boyfriend of 2 years was planning to vanish from my life like I'd never mattered. Like our relationship was just an inconvenience he needed to handle before starting his real life with someone else. I heard the bathroom door open, Chris's footsteps coming down the hall. I made a decision in about 3 seconds. I forwarded everything to my phone, every message, every photo, created a new email draft and sent the whole conversation thread to myself. Then I put the phone back in his jacket pocket and sat down just as he walked into the dining room. He smiled at me, asked if I was okay. I smiled back and said I was fine. My mum brought out her homemade tiramisu. My dad poured coffee. We sat there like a normal family having a normal dinner, and the whole time I was watching Chris laugh at my dad's jokes and compliment my mum's cooking, knowing what I knew. Watching him perform the role of good boyfriend while actively planning to ghost me in 3 weeks. He was so comfortable with it. That's what got me. He wasn't nervous or guilty. He was relaxed, enjoying dessert, probably thinking about how smoothly his plan was going. I waited until everyone had finished eating. My mum was clearing plates. My dad was leaning back in his chair, satisfied and full. Chris was checking his regular phone, scrolling through something. Then I spoke up. I said I had an announcement to make. Everyone looked at me. Chris put down his phone, curious. I told them I'd found Chris's work phone while he was in the bathroom, that I'd read his messages, that he'd been cheating on me for months with a woman named Claire, that they were planning to move in together, and that he was planning to ghost me in 3 weeks. The room went completely silent. My mum's hand froze halfway to the table with a plate. My dad's expression shifted from confused to understanding to absolutely furious in about 2 seconds. Chris's face drained of all color. He started stammering, said it wasn't what it looked like, that I'd misunderstood, that those messages were taken out of context. I pulled out my phone and started reading messages out loud. The one about the weekend getaway, the one about apartment hunting, the one where he called me the other problem he needed to get rid of. Chris tried to interrupt, said we should talk about this privately, but I wasn't done. I read the message where he told Claire I was clingy and dramatic, the one where he said ghosting me would be easier than having an actual breakup conversation. My dad stood up. He's not a big guy, my dad, but he's got this quiet authority that makes people listen. He told Chris to leave. Now. Chris tried to explain. He reached for my hand across the table, said we could work through this, that he'd made a mistake, but he loved me. The same mouth that had called me a problem to another woman was now telling me he loved me. I pulled my hand away and told him we were done, that he should consider himself ghosted, since that was apparently his preferred method of ending relationships. My mom, bless her, started packing up the leftover lasagna she'd promised to send home with us. She very deliberately packed it into one container and handed it to me. Not him. The pettiness was beautiful. Chris grabbed his jacket, realized his work phone was in the pocket, and looked at me with this mixture of betrayal and anger, like I was the one who'd done something wrong, like I'd violated his privacy instead of uncovered his lies. My dad walked him to the door. I heard them talking in the hallway, my dad's voice low and firm. Then the front door opened and closed. Chris sent me about 40 texts that night, apologizing, explaining, trying to justify everything. He said Claire didn't mean anything, that I was the one he really wanted, that finding his phone was an invasion of privacy, and we needed to talk about boundaries. Boundaries. The man who'd been living a double life for months wanted to talk to me about boundaries. I blocked his number. Blocked Claire too, just in case. Changed the locks on my apartment even though he'd never had a key because I didn't trust him not to have made a copy. He tried reaching out through mutual friends, told them I'd overreacted, that it was just a misunderstanding, that he'd never actually planned to leave me. Our friend Mike actually called me to suggest I hear Chris out. I sent Mike the screenshots. Mike stopped calling. The thing that stuck with me most wasn't even the cheating. It was the ghost plan. He was going to let me sit there wondering what I'd done wrong. Probably would have let me text and call and worry while he was off starting his new life. That level of cowardice is almost impressive. Last I heard, Chris and Claire broke up about 2 months after all this happened. Apparently, she found out he'd been lying to her too, telling her I was just a roommate, that our relationship had ended months ago. Turns out, when your whole relationship is built on lies, it doesn't hold up well under scrutiny. I ran into him at a coffee shop a few months back. He tried to apologize again, said he'd been going through some stuff, that he'd handled everything wrong. I told him I appreciated the apology, but I had somewhere to be. I didn't actually have anywhere to be. I just didn't want to hear it. My mum still asks about him sometimes. Not because she misses him, but because she wants to make sure I'm really over it. I am. Mostly. Some days I still get angry about the ghost plan, but then I remember that dinner, the look on his face when I read those messages out loud, and I feel a little better. Sometimes you don't even realize you're the backup plan until the evidence literally relocates you. I'd spent months planning the move from Seattle to North Carolina, gave my 2 weeks' notice at a job I actually loved, said tearful goodbyes to friends I'd known since college, packed up my entire life into boxes that barely fit in a U-Haul. All because Ryan had finally gotten that big promotion he'd been working toward, the one that required relocating across the country. He'd asked me to come with him, said it was time we started our life together for real, away from the chaos and negativity of Seattle. He made it sound like an adventure, like we were finally escaping to build something that was just ours. The drive took us 4 days. Ryan was excited the whole time, talking about the apartment he'd found, the neighborhood, how much I was going to love North Carolina. He'd been out there for 2 weeks already, setting things up while I finished my last days at work and handled the logistics of the move. He showed me photos of the place, a nice 2-bedroom with hardwood floors and big windows. It looked perfect. He looked happy. I felt like we were finally on the right track after 2 years of dating long distance, on and off while he traveled for work. We got to the apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. I was exhausted from the drive, but the place was even better in person. Ryan had already moved in some furniture, set up the bedroom, even stocked the fridge. It felt lived in and welcoming. I remember thinking he'd really put effort into making this feel like home for us. 3 weeks went by. I was still unpacking, still job hunting, still adjusting to being in a completely new state where I didn't know anyone. Ryan was busy with work, gone most days, and I spent a lot of time alone in that apartment, wondering if I'd made the right choice. But I kept telling myself it would get better once I found work, once I made some friends, once we settled into a routine. Then Ashley showed up. It was a Saturday morning. Ryan had left early for what he said was a mandatory team breakfast with his new co-workers. I was still in my pajamas, drinking coffee and scrolling through job listings when I heard a key turning in the lock. I figured Ryan had forgotten something and come back. But the person who walked through that door wasn't Ryan. She was maybe a few years older than me, blonde, carrying a weekend bag and a grocery tote. She walked in like she owned the place. Didn't even notice me sitting on the couch at first. When she finally looked up and saw me, she jumped, actually dropped the grocery bag. Apples rolled across the floor. "Who are you?" she asked, and I could see her mind trying to make sense of my presence. "I'm Ryan's girlfriend," I said slowly. "Who are you?" The look on her face, I'll never forget it. Confusion, then recognition, then this awful dawning horror. "I'm Ashley," she said, "Ryan's girlfriend." We stood there staring at each other for what felt like forever. Then she held up her key. "He gave me this last month. I was supposed to come visit this weekend, surprise him." Her voice cracked on the last word. I felt the room tilt. I asked her how long she and Ryan had been together. 4 years, she said. 4 years. They'd been dating since before I even met him. She pulled out her phone and started showing me photos. Ryan and Ashley at Christmas. Ryan and Ashley on vacation in Mexico. Ryan and Ashley at what looked like her parents' house, his arm around her, both of them smiling like people who'd been together forever. But that wasn't even the worst part. As we compared stories, the scope of Ryan's lies became clear. He'd told Ashley he was relocating for work, but would visit Seattle monthly. He'd told me he was finally escaping his toxic hometown. Ashley had helped him apartment hunt over FaceTime, thought she'd join him once he got settled. She'd been planning to quit her own job and move out here in a few months. Every business trip Ryan had taken back to Seattle over the past 2 years, He'd been with Ashley every time he said he needed space or had family obligations. Ashley. The weekend he told me he had to help his sister move, he was celebrating Ashley's birthday. My entire relationship with Ryan had been constructed in the gaps of his real life with her. I was the affair that got too serious, the side piece who wasn't supposed to follow him across the country, and he'd been too much of a coward to end it with either of us, so he just kept lying, kept juggling, kept thinking he could maintain both relationships indefinitely. Ashley started crying. Then I started crying. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, two strangers who'd just discovered we'd been dating the same man, and we cried together for maybe 20 minutes. Then the crying turned into anger, and the anger turned into something productive. We started going through everything. Ryan's laptop was sitting on the kitchen counter, unlocked. We found emails between him and Ashley going back years. We found emails between him and me. We found a spreadsheet, an actual spreadsheet, where he'd been tracking his lies to keep his stories straight, which weekends he was supposedly where, which excuses he'd used with whom, notes about conversations so he wouldn't contradict himself later. The level of planning was almost impressive in how pathological it was. He'd been living a double life so meticulously that neither of us had suspected a thing. Ashley thought his frequent work trips explained everything. I thought his complicated past in Seattle explained why he didn't want me visiting much. And here's where it gets absurd. Ryan's entire story about relocating for work, completely fabricated. Ashley called his boss, used the number from an email we found. Turned out Ryan had actually quit his job in Seattle 3 months ago, had been freelancing and living off savings while he figured out his next move. The promotion, the company relocation, the new position in North Carolina, all of it was fiction. He'd invented an entire career trajectory to justify the move and keep both of us on the hook. The man had no job. He'd been burning through his savings to maintain 2 relationships and a cross-country charade. We found credit card statements showing he was in serious debt. The furniture in the apartment, rented. The car he'd been driving, leased under Ashley's name because his credit was shot. Ashley and I looked at each other, and without saying a word, we both knew what we had to do. We started packing. Every single thing that belonged to Ryan went into boxes. His clothes, his toiletries, his laptop, his books, everything. We packed his rented furniture into his car, every piece we could fit. It took us 3 hours, but we got most of it in there, strapped to the roof, crammed into the trunk, filling the back seat. Then we called a locksmith, had the locks changed while we waited for Ryan to come home from his fake team breakfast. The locksmith asked if we were sure, seemed concerned about the legality of it all. Ashley showed him the lease, which was in her name. Ryan had convinced her to sign for it remotely, said it would be easier since he was already in North Carolina. Another lie that actually worked in our favor. Ryan came home around 2 in the afternoon. We watched him from the window as he pulled into the parking lot and saw his car packed full of his belongings. He got out slowly, looking confused, then concerned, then panicked when he tried his key and it didn't work. Ashley opened the door. I stood behind her, both of us blocking the entrance. "We know everything," Ashley said. Her voice was steady, cold. "We talked to your boss, we read your emails. We know you've been lying to both of us for years." Ryan tried to explain. Oh, did he try? He stammered something about how it was complicated, how he cared about both of us, how he'd been trying to figure things out. Ashley cut him off. "You have until Monday to find somewhere else to live. Your stuff is in your car. Don't contact either of us again." He looked at me like I might be the weak link, like maybe I'd give in. But I just shook my head. I'd given up everything for him. My job, my friends, my entire life in Seattle, and it had all been based on lies. We closed the door, changed our social media passwords, blocked his number, blocked his email. Ashley and I sat in that apartment, now just ours, and we started talking for real. About our lives, our families, what we wanted next. She'd been planning to leave her job anyway, hated Seattle, and actually liked what she'd seen of North Carolina during her apartment hunting video calls with Ryan. So we made a decision that probably sounds insane, but felt completely right in the moment. We became roommates, split the rent 50-50, turned the second bedroom into her actual bedroom instead of Ryan's fake office. Ashley gave notice at her job, packed up her life in Seattle, and moved across the country just like I had. I'm still in North Carolina. Ashley and I are still roommates. actually became genuine friends through the weirdest bonding experience imaginable. We joke sometimes about how Ryan technically did us both a favor by being such a spectacular disaster of a human being. I found a better job than the one I left. Ashley started her own business. We're both doing fine. As for Ryan, last we heard, he moved back in with his parents in Seattle, completely broke, trying to rebuild his life from scratch. I don't feel bad for him. Not even a little bit. He made his choices. He crafted those lies. He thought he could have everything without consequences. Turns out, consequences found him anyway. Family secrets can be just as devastating as romantic betrayals, especially when parents choose protecting one child over justice for everyone else. Growing up, my brother Ethan could do no wrong, literally. Every time something went sideways, my parents found a way to explain it away or blame someone else. When he crashed Dad's car at 17, it was the other driver's fault, even though the police report said otherwise. When he got suspended from school for fighting, the other kid had provoked him. When money went missing from Mum's purse, well, she must have miscounted. I watched this pattern play out for years, and honestly, I'd gotten used to it. Ethan was the favorite. I was the responsible one who paid my own way and kept my head down. What I didn't know was just how far my parents were willing to go to protect their golden boy. I found out the hard way on a random Saturday afternoon when I stopped by their house to borrow a ladder. They weren't home, but I had a key, so I let myself in and headed to the garage. That's where I saw it, just sitting there on a shelf behind some old paint cans. A jewelry box I recognized immediately because I'd complimented Mrs. Chen on it about a month ago when I was at her house picking up a package she'd accepted for me. Mrs. Chen lived 3 doors down from my parents. Her place had been broken into 2 weeks prior. Someone had smashed a back window, ransacked her bedroom, and stolen jewelry, cash, and some electronics. The whole neighborhood had been on edge since then. People installed security cameras, started locking doors they used to leave open, the whole thing. And here was her distinctive jewelry box, the one with the hand-painted cherry blossoms on the lid, sitting in my parents' garage next to a laptop I didn't recognize, and a watch that definitely didn't belong to anyone in my family. I took photos of everything. Then I called my parents and told them I needed to talk to them immediately. They came home within 20 minutes, and the second my mom saw me standing in the garage, her face went white. She knew exactly why I was there. Dad tried the usual deflection at first, asking why I was snooping around, but I cut him off. I held up my phone with the photos and asked point blank if Ethan had broken into Mrs. Chen's house. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Then Mom started crying, and Dad sat down on his workbench looking about 10 years older than he had 5 minutes ago. They admitted it. Ethan had done it. He'd been struggling with what Dad called a problem, which I quickly understood meant some kind of addiction or compulsion they'd been covering up for years. This wasn't the first incident, not even close. Over the next hour, they laid out a history I'd had no idea existed. Ethan had vandalized the high school baseball field 2 years ago, spray painting obscenities all over the dugout. My parents had quietly donated money for the cleanup, and the school had agreed not to press charges. He'd stolen from a local convenience store multiple times. My parents had a tab there now, essentially paying off the owner to keep quiet. And there was another burglary about 8 months back, a house 4 blocks over. My parents had somehow figured out it was Ethan, tracked down what he'd stolen, and returned everything with a cash payment and a story about a troubled youth who needed help, not jail time. 3 incidents that I knew of now, plus Mrs. Chen's house. 4 crimes that my parents had actively covered up, paying off victims to protect their son from consequences. And during this entire time, while they were throwing money at Ethan's problems and shielding him from the law, I'd been working 2 jobs to pay off my college loans because they said they couldn't afford to help me. I'd been eating ramen for dinner and skipping social events because I couldn't afford them, while they were apparently sitting on enough cash to bribe multiple victims and buy Ethan's way out of trouble. The betrayal hit me in waves. First the shock of learning my brother was a criminal, then the anger at my parents for enabling him, then the deep, burning resentment at the unfairness of it all. I'd done everything right, studied hard, worked multiple jobs, stayed out of trouble. And what did I get? Debt and indifference. Ethan stole and destroyed and hurt people, and he got protection and endless second chances. My mom begged me to stay quiet. She actually got on her knees in that garage and begged, said that exposing this would destroy the family, that Ethan needed help, not punishment, that going to the police would ruin his future. Dad stood behind her looking broken, nodding along with everything she said. They asked me to think about family loyalty, about giving Ethan another chance, about how we handle things privately instead of airing our dirty laundry. I told them I needed time to think about it. Then I left. Drove around for about 2 hours just processing everything, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Mrs. Chen was elderly and living on a fixed income. She'd told the whole neighborhood how violated she felt after the break-in, how she couldn't sleep anymore, how she'd lost items with sentimental value that couldn't be replaced. And my parents knew who'd done it. They knew, and they'd let her suffer in fear while they hid the evidence in their garage and pretended to be sympathetic neighbors. That's when everything unraveled. I couldn't be complicit in this. I couldn't look Mrs. Chen in the eye knowing what I knew and do nothing. So I went to the police station, walked in with my phone full of photos and told them everything. Gave them a statement, showed them the evidence, explained the pattern of cover-ups my parents had admitted to. The detective I spoke with was sympathetic but firm. He said they'd need to investigate, talk to my parents and Ethan, verify everything I told them. They executed a search warrant on my parents' house the next day, found all the stolen items exactly where I'd photographed them. Ethan was arrested that evening. My parents called me screaming, crying, asking how I could do this to my own brother, to my own family. Mom said I was dead to her. Dad said I'd destroyed everything. Ethan didn't call at all, which somehow hurt more than if he'd called to yell at me. The police investigation uncovered even more than I'd known about. Turns out there were 2 additional incidents my parents hadn't even told me about. Ethan had been busy, and my parents had been very, very committed to protecting him. The detective connected with the previous victims, the ones my parents had paid off, and several of them agreed to give statements now that they knew there was a pattern and that they hadn't been Ethan's only targets. Building a case took weeks. During that time, I was completely cut off from my family. My parents wouldn't speak to me. Extended family members who heard their version of events started calling me a traitor, saying I should have handled it privately, asking how I could send my own brother to jail. Some cousins blocked me on social media. An aunt sent me a long email about family loyalty and forgiveness that made me want to throw my phone across the room. But something else happened too. Mrs. Chen found out I was the one who'd come forward. She showed up at my apartment with tears in her eyes and hugged me for about 5 minutes straight, said she'd been having nightmares, that knowing someone had violated her home had been eating away at her, and now she finally had answers and could start healing. The family from the burglary 8 months prior reached out through the detective to thank me. They said my parents' hush money had felt wrong at the time, but they'd been struggling financially and had accepted it. Now they felt like they'd gotten real justice instead of just a payoff. Ethan ended up taking a plea deal. Got 2 years in county jail plus probation and mandatory counseling. Could have been worse if he'd gone to trial, but his lawyer convinced him to take responsibility. My parents hired the lawyer, paid for everything, and attended every court date. They never once looked at me during the proceedings, even though I was there too, sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom. Here's where it gets absurd. After Ethan was sentenced, my dad sent me a letter. Not an email, an actual handwritten letter. In it he said they understood why I'd done what I did, that maybe on some level they'd even known it was coming, but they could never forgive me for choosing strangers over family, for destroying Ethan's future, for tearing apart everything they'd built. He said I was no longer welcome at family gatherings, that my name wouldn't be mentioned in their house, that as far as they were concerned, they had 1 son now instead of 2 children. The disownment was official. I was the family pariah, the traitor who'd valued justice over loyalty. And you know what? I sleep better now than I have in years, because every time I doubt myself, every time I wonder if I did the right thing, I think about Mrs. Chen getting her jewelry box back. I think about the other victims who finally got to tell their stories. I think about all the future victims who won't exist because Ethan is finally facing consequences instead of being enabled. My parents think they were protecting family, but what they were actually doing was protecting a cycle of harm. They were teaching Ethan that actions don't have consequences if you have the right people covering for you. They were telling him that victims don't matter as much as maintaining appearances, and they were funding his destructive behavior with money they claimed not to have when I needed help with college. I lost my family over this. That's not nothing. It hurts, But I gained something too. I gained the knowledge that when it mattered, when I had to choose between being complicit and doing what was right, I chose right. I can look at myself in the mirror. I can walk past Mrs. Chen's house without guilt. I can sleep without wondering what Ethan might do next because someone finally stopped him. The extended family that cut me off? I figure that's a self-solving problem. Anyone who thinks covering up crimes is acceptable family behavior isn't someone I need in my life anyway. And the few relatives who reached out privately to say they understood, even if they couldn't say so publicly, those relationships got stronger, built on actual honesty instead of whatever twisted version of loyalty my parents had been practicing. Ethan gets out in about 14 months. I don't know if he'll reach out or if he hates me as much as our parents do. I don't know if he's actually getting help or just counting days, but that's not my responsibility anymore. I did what I could. I told the truth. Everything else is up to him. Holiday gatherings are supposed to bring families together, but sometimes one toast can detonate everything at once. I used to think my family was pretty normal. We had our quirks, sure, but every Thanksgiving we'd all gather at my parents' house, eat too much turkey, watch football, and argue about politics in that way families do, where everyone's half joking, but also kind of serious. It was tradition, comfortable, predictable. This particular Thanksgiving started out like all the others. My mom Linda had been cooking since dawn. The turkey was golden and perfect. The dining room table was set with the good china we only use twice a year. My siblings and I were helping in the kitchen while our kids ran around the backyard. My dad was watching the game with my uncles, Jim and Steve, all of them nursing beers and talking too loud about plays they would have made differently. By the time we sat down to eat, everyone was in good spirits. Maybe too good in Jim's case. Uncle Jim had always been the drinker in the family, the one who got a little too honest after his third beer. But he was harmless, funny even. We all had our Jim stories, moments where he'd said something inappropriate at a wedding, or told an embarrassing story about someone at a funeral. It was just who he was. Dinner was amazing. My mom had outdone herself. We went around the table saying what we were thankful for, the usual stuff. Family, health, the food in front of us. My dad made a joke about being thankful the Cowboys were losing. Everyone laughed. It felt warm and safe and exactly like Thanksgiving was supposed to feel. Then Jim stood up. He had this look on his face, sentimental and glazed over from the wine he'd been drinking since noon. He raised his glass and asked for everyone's attention. We all figured he was going to make some generic toast about family, or maybe tell an old story about my grandparents. Instead, he said something that made the entire room go silent. To Linda, he slurred, grinning at my mum, who gave us the greatest gift 40 years ago, letting us all pretend. The table froze. Forks stopped mid-air. My mum's face went white. My dad looked confused, glancing between Jim and my mum, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces to. Jim kept going, oblivious to the shift in energy. 40 years of keeping that secret. That's real family loyalty right there. My Aunt Karen, Jim's wife, grabbed his arm and hissed at him to sit down. But the damage was done. The words were out there, hanging in the air above the mashed potatoes and green bean casserole. My sister Ashley spoke first. She asked what Jim was talking about. What secret? Jim looked around the table, and I watched realization dawn on his drunk face that maybe he'd just said something he shouldn't have. But it was too late to take it back. My mum started crying, not loud, dramatic crying, quiet tears that she tried to wipe away quickly, like if she did it fast enough we wouldn't notice. My dad put his hand on her arm and asked what was going on. His voice was calm, but I could hear the edge underneath it. That's when everything unraveled. My mum, through tears, admitted that she'd had a baby when she was 17. Before she met my dad, she'd given the baby up for adoption and never told us because it was painful and complicated and she thought it was better if we didn't know. The family had agreed to keep it secret, to let her move on with her life. We all sat there processing this. I had a half-sibling somewhere I'd never met. My mum had carried this secret for 4 decades. It was a lot, but honestly, I could understand it. Teenage pregnancy in the 70s, strict parents, limited options. It made sense why she'd kept it quiet. But then Aunt Karen, in what I can only describe as the worst possible moment of panic and honesty, blurted out another piece of information. It wasn't even his baby, she said, pointing at my dad. It was Steve's. The room, which had already been tense, became absolutely electric, with shocked silence. My dad turned to look at his brother Steve, my uncle, who was sitting 3 seats down, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. My mom was shaking her head, crying harder now, trying to say something, but no words were coming out. My dad stood up. He asked Steve if it was true. His voice was eerily calm, the kind of calm that comes right before an explosion. Uncle Steve didn't answer right away. He just stared at his plate. Then, finally, he nodded. My dad walked out, didn't say another word, just pushed his chair back, grabbed his jacket from the hall and left. We heard his car start a minute later and then he was gone. The table erupted after that. Everyone started talking at once. My siblings were asking my mum how this was possible. I was asking Uncle Steve how long he'd known. Aunt Karen was yelling at Jim for being an idiot. Jim was defending himself, saying everyone already knew, so what did it matter? Except clearly everyone didn't know. My dad hadn't known. I hadn't known. My siblings hadn't known. Turns out different people knew different pieces of the story. Jim knew my mom had given up a baby. Karen knew Steve was the father. My other aunt had known about the adoption, but not who the father was. They'd all kept their little fragments of truth to themselves for 40 years, and nobody had ever put the whole picture together, except maybe my mum and Steve. My mum tried to explain. She and Steve had dated briefly when she was 17, and he was 19. It was a summer thing, nothing serious. And when she got pregnant, he freaked out. He was heading to college, had a football scholarship, wasn't ready to be a father. They decided together that adoption was the best option. She broke up with him, moved on, and met my dad a few years later. She never told my dad about the baby because by the time they were serious, it felt like ancient history, something from a different life that didn't need to be brought into their new one. Steve said he'd thought about telling my dad 1,000 times over the years, but the moment never seemed right, and the longer he waited, the harder it became. So he just didn't. He lived with it, showed up to family dinners and holidays, and pretended everything was normal. The kids had been ushered outside by this point. My cousin was watching all of them in the backyard, probably hearing everything through the windows, but keeping them distracted. Inside, the adults were falling apart. My sister asked if anyone had tried to contact the baby, now obviously an adult. My mom said no. It had been a closed adoption. She didn't even know if her child would want to hear from her. I asked why Uncle Steve had stayed in our lives if this secret was so heavy. Why come to every holiday, every birthday, every family event, knowing what he knew? He didn't have a good answer, just said that we were still family, that he loved us, that the secret didn't change that, which felt like a cop-out, but also maybe the only honest thing he'd said all night. Things went from bad to unhinged. My brother started yelling at Steve for being a coward. My sister was crying, saying she felt like her whole childhood was a lie. Aunt Karen was still mad at Jim, who was now sulking in the corner, realizing he'd destroyed Thanksgiving forever. My mom was trying to call my dad, but he wasn't answering. I just sat there feeling numb. I had a half-sibling. My uncle was their father. My mum had hidden this for my entire life. My dad had just found out his brother had a child with his wife before they'd even met. It was too much information to process all at once. We didn't finish dinner. People started leaving in clusters. My sister and her family left first. My brother stayed longer, trying to get more answers from my mum, but eventually he left too. The uncles and aunts filtered out, all of them avoiding eye contact with each other. By 8 o'clock, it was just me and my mum in that big house, surrounded by uneaten food and the wreckage of what used to be our family unity. My mum apologized to me, said she never wanted us to find out this way, that Jim was drunk and stupid and she was going to kill him. I told her I wasn't mad at her, which was true. I was confused and hurt and overwhelmed, but not mad. She'd been 17 and scared and did what she thought was best. I couldn't fault her for that. What I struggled with was the lying, not the original secret, but the 40 years of everyone knowing pieces and nobody saying anything. The casual deception at every family gathering. The performance of normalcy while this massive truth sat in the middle of the room unacknowledged. My dad came home around midnight. I was still there, helping my mum clean up. He didn't say much, just asked my mum if they could talk. I took that as my cue to leave. I found out later they separated for a few months, went to counseling, eventually worked through it, but their relationship was never quite the same. My dad forgave my mum, but forgiving Steve took longer. They're civil now, but they're not brothers the way they used to be. As for me, I did some digging, Found the adoption records, which wasn't easy, but also wasn't impossible. Tracked down my half-sibling, a woman named Rachel who lives in Oregon. I reached out carefully, not sure what to expect. She was wonderful, open and curious and kind. She'd always known she was adopted and had wondered about her birth family, but never pushed because her adoptive parents were amazing and she didn't want to hurt them. We've been in regular contact for about a year now. She's met my kids. We're planning a trip to visit her next summer. My mom met Rachel 6 months ago. It was emotional and beautiful and complicated. Rachel doesn't blame her for the adoption, says she had a great life and understands the circumstances. They talk on the phone now every few weeks. We haven't had a family Thanksgiving since that night. Everyone kind of does their own thing now. My siblings and I get together sometimes, but the big extended family gatherings are done. Too much damage, too many hurt feelings, too many secrets that came out in the worst possible way. Sometimes family fraud isn't just emotional, it's financial, and one sister learned that identity theft hits different when it's at the dinner table. I'd been having issues with my credit for months, applied for a car loan back in February and got denied, which made no sense because I'd always been careful with money. Paid my bills on time, kept my credit card balances low, did everything you're supposed to do. The rejection letter said something about my debt-to-income ratio being too high, but I didn't have any debt. I figured it was a mistake, maybe someone with a similar name, and I kept meaning to look into it, but life got busy and I never followed up. My family does dinner together every Sunday at my parents' house. It's this whole tradition we've had since we were kids. Everyone shows up, my mum cooks way too much food, we sit around the table for hours just talking. Usually it's nice. Boring sometimes, but nice. That particular Sunday in late September felt like any other. My sister Kayla was there with her husband, my brother came with his girlfriend, and we were all eating pot roast and arguing about whether the new highway expansion was going to help or hurt traffic when my phone rang. I normally wouldn't answer during dinner. My mum hates that. But I didn't recognize the number and I'd been waiting to hear back about a job application. So I excused myself and picked up. The voice on the other end was professional, clipped, the kind of tone that immediately puts you on edge. They asked if I was me, confirmed my date of birth, then said they were calling from a debt collection agency regarding an outstanding balance of $34,000. I actually laughed, told them they had the wrong person, that I didn't have any debt like that. The woman on the phone rattled off an account number and said it was a credit card opened in my name 3 years ago, that payments had stopped 14 months back and the account had been sent to collections. I told her again that she was mistaken, that I'd never opened that card. She asked if anyone else had access to my personal information, social security number, date of birth, address, and something in my stomach dropped. I looked up from my phone and saw my sister Kayla staring at me from across the table. Her face had gone completely white. The debt collector was still talking, saying something about verification and payment plans, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching Kayla, and she was watching me, and there was this moment of horrible understanding between us. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I asked Kayla what she did, just like that. What did you do? The whole table went quiet. My mum asked what was going on, but I kept my eyes on my sister. She looked like she was going to be sick. Her husband put his hand on her arm, confused, asking her what was happening. She didn't answer, so I told everyone what the debt collector had just said. $34,000 in debt on a credit card I never opened. And I watched my sister, waiting for her to tell me I was wrong, that it was a coincidence, that she had nothing to do with it. Instead, she started crying. My dad asked if we could talk about this after dinner. Actually said that, like we could just finish our pot roast and deal with identity theft over dessert. But I wasn't moving. I wanted answers right there, in front of everyone, because I had a feeling that if we went somewhere private, my family would find a way to smooth this over and make it go away. Kayla finally admitted it. Said she'd used my information to open credit cards 3 years ago. Not just one card, multiple cards. She'd been planning to pay everything back before I found out, but things got out of hand. She had a shopping problem, she said, an addiction. She kept thinking the next purchase would make her feel better, that she'd stop after one more thing, but it spiraled and suddenly she was in too deep and didn't know how to fix it. I asked her how she got my information. She looked at the table when she answered, said she'd found my social security card in a drawer at our parents' house years ago, back when I was still living there during college. Took a photo of it. Used that plus information she already knew about me to open accounts. Easy as that. My brother asked how much total. Kayla didn't answer, so I did the math out loud. 34,000 on one card, and if there were multiple cards, like she'd said, probably more. She finally whispered that it was closer to 50,000 across 4 different accounts. $50,000 in my name, destroying my credit while I had no idea it was even happening. My mom immediately went into fix-it mode, said we needed to work this out as a family, that Kayla clearly needed help, that we should handle this privately without getting outside people involved. My dad agreed, said Kayla had made a mistake, but she was family, that we don't turn on family, that there had to be a way to resolve this without making it worse. I looked at my parents and realized they were more concerned about protecting Kayla than they were about what she'd done to me. Not once had either of them asked if I was okay. Not once had they acknowledged that their daughter had committed a serious crime against their other daughter. They just wanted it to go away quietly. That's when I pulled my phone back out and called the police. Right there at the dinner table, my mother actually gasped. Kayla started sobbing harder. My dad told me to hang up, that I was being dramatic, that we could handle this ourselves. But I didn't hang up. I told the dispatcher that I needed to report identity theft, that my sister had stolen my personal information and opened credit cards in my name. The whole table erupted. Kayla's husband was yelling at me, asking how I could do this to family. My mom was crying, begging me to reconsider. My brother just sat there looking shocked. My dad kept saying I was making a mistake, that I'd regret this. But here's the thing. I wouldn't regret it. Kayla had stolen my identity. She'd ruined my credit. She'd put me $50,000 in debt and never once thought to tell me, to apologize, to try to make it right. She was only sorry because she got caught. The police came to the house, took statements from me and Kayla. I showed them the call from the debt collector, gave them what information I had. They asked Kayla direct questions, and she admitted to everything. They arrested her that night. At my parents' house, in front of the whole family, they put her in handcuffs and walked her out. My family didn't speak to me for weeks after that. My mom called me cruel. My dad said I'd destroyed Kayla's life over money. Her husband blamed me for everything that happened next. Kayla was charged with identity theft and fraud. The prosecution offered her a plea deal. 6 months in jail, restitution, probation. My parents begged me to drop the charges, said Kayla had learned her lesson, that jail time was excessive, that I was being vindictive. They offered to pay back some of the debt themselves if I'd just let it go. But I didn't let it go. I pressed charges. I testified. I watched my sister get sentenced. She served 6 months, got out 3 months ago. I haven't spoken to her since that dinner. Haven't spoken to my parents much either, though that's starting to change slowly. They're in therapy now, dealing with what the therapist apparently calls enabling patterns. Learning that protecting one child at the expense of another isn't love, it's dysfunction. I'm rebuilding my credit. It's a slow process. Every month I'm disputing fraudulent accounts, filing paperwork, dealing with credit bureaus. I got approved for a secured credit card last month, which felt like a small victory. The car loan is still out of reach, but I'm getting there. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty about getting my sister arrested. The answer is no, not even a little bit. She made a choice, multiple choices actually, over the course of 3 years. She chose to steal my identity. She chose to open those accounts. She chose to spend that money. She chose not to tell me, not to make it right, not to face the consequences of what she'd done until she was forced to. I didn't destroy her life. She did that herself. I just refused to let her destroy mine too. DNA tests are supposed to bring families together with heritage discoveries, but sometimes the heritage they uncover wasn't meant to be found. I thought it would be fun. That's the part that keeps me up at night. I genuinely thought I was giving my family a cool gift, something we could bond over during the holidays. One of those Ancestry DNA kits that everyone was talking about, the ones that tell you what percentage Irish or Italian or whatever you are. I bought 5 of them, one for me, one for each of my siblings, and one for each of our parents. Wrapped them up nice, put them under the tree, imagined us all laughing about discovering we're secretly descended from Vikings or something. Christmas morning was great. Everyone seemed excited. My mum made a joke about hoping we weren't related to any famous criminals. My dad said he was betting on Scottish heritage. My brother Matt and my sister Lauren were already comparing which regions they thought would show up. We all did the cheek swabs right there in the living room, packaged them up, and sent them off. Then we went back to our normal lives and mostly forgot about it. 3 months later, the email arrived. Results were ready. I logged in first because I'm impatient like that, and I was clicking through the ancestry breakdown when I noticed something weird in the relatives section. It showed my mum as an immediate family match, which made sense. It showed my siblings as half-siblings, not full. I stared at that for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Then I checked my dad's results. No paternal match. According to the DNA, the man who raised me wasn't my biological father. I felt sick. Checked Matt's results. Same thing. Half-sibling to me, no match to dad. Lauren's results. Identical situation. All three of us kids matched to mom, but not to dad. And we all matched to each other as half-siblings, which meant we shared a biological father who wasn't the man we'd called dad our entire lives. I didn't know what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to pretend I'd never seen it, delete the results, and go on with my life. But I couldn't. This was too big. So I called a family meeting, told everyone we needed to talk about the DNA results. Mum's face went pale the second I said it. She knew. Of course she knew. I pulled up the results on my laptop and showed everyone. Dad stared at the screen like he was reading a foreign language. Matt started asking questions rapid fire, trying to find an explanation that made sense. Lauren just sat there in silence, and Mum, she didn't say anything at first, just looked at her hands. Then she started talking, quiet at first, then faster. Like once she started, she couldn't stop. She'd had an affair, a long one, 15 years with a family friend named Dan, who used to come to all our barbecues and birthday parties. Dan, who my dad had considered a close friend. Dan, who'd moved away when I was 7, supposedly for a job opportunity. Turns out that move had been the end of the affair, or at least that's what Mum claimed. All three of us kids were Dan's, not Dad's. Mom had known the whole time, obviously, had watched Dad raise children that weren't biologically his, had let him believe we were his family, had built an entire life on a foundation of lies that lasted almost 3 decades. My dad just sat there, didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't react at all for the longest time. Then he said something that broke my heart. He said he'd suspected. Years ago, he'd noticed things that didn't add up. Times when Mum was distant or Dan was too familiar, but he'd pushed it down because he didn't want to know. He'd chosen denial because the truth was too painful. And now here it was anyway, unavoidable and confirmed by science. The room exploded after that. Matt started yelling at Mom, demanding to know how she could do this. Lauren yelled at me, said I'd ruined everything by buying those stupid tests, that we could have all gone on being happy if I'd just minded my own business. Mum was crying, trying to apologize to Dad, who wasn't even looking at her anymore. And I just stood there feeling like I'd detonated a bomb in the middle of my family. But that wasn't even the worst part. A week later, Mum admitted she'd reached out to Dan and told him about the DNA results, and Dan wanted to meet us, wanted a relationship with his biological children. He'd apparently never stopped thinking about us, had followed our lives from a distance through social media and mutual acquaintances. Now that the secret was out, he saw it as an opportunity to finally be a real father. The audacity of that actually stunned me. This man had participated in deceiving my dad for 15 years, had walked away from 3 kids he'd helped create, and now he wanted to swoop in and play daddy because a DNA test gave him permission. I told Mom absolutely not. I wanted nothing to do with Dan. He wasn't my father, Dad was my father. Biology didn't change the fact that Dad was the one who taught me to ride a bike, helped with homework, showed up to every school event, paid for everything, loved us unconditionally, even when apparently he'd suspected we might not be his. My siblings didn't agree. Matt, after the initial anger wore off, started talking to Dan, met up with him a few times, said he wanted to understand where he came from, that having questions about his biological father was normal. Lauren went the opposite direction, cut off contact with everyone for months, stopped answering calls, stopped coming to family gatherings, just disappeared into her own life because she couldn't handle the mess. Mum and Dad's divorce was finalized 6 months after that Christmas. Dad moved out, got a small apartment across town. He tried to maintain relationships with all of us, but it was strained. Matt's relationship with Dan complicated things. Every time Matt mentioned his biological father, I could see Dad flinch. Lauren's absence left this hole in every gathering, and I was stuck in the middle, angry at everyone for different reasons. Things went from bad to unhinged when Dan showed up at our traditional family reunion that summer. Mum had invited him, didn't tell anyone, just brought him along like it was perfectly normal to introduce your affair partner to the family you'd destroyed. Dad wasn't there, obviously, but the rest of the extended family was. Aunts, uncles, cousins who had no idea about any of this drama. I left, just walked out. Matt stayed and actually introduced Dan to relatives as his father, which felt like a betrayal on a level I couldn't articulate. Lauren wasn't there at all, the family reunion tradition we'd had for decades. The one constant in our lives ended that day. It was the last one we ever had as a complete family. Now we have separate gatherings. Dad does holidays with me and sometimes Matt if the timing works out. Mom does her own thing with Matt primarily, and occasionally Lauren surfaces for those. Dan is apparently part of that equation now, though I wouldn't know because I refuse to attend anything he's at. The extended family is confused and fractured, taking sides or trying to stay neutral in a situation where neutrality feels like cowardice. My siblings are still furious with me. Lauren sent me a long text about 6 months ago saying I destroyed the family by giving everyone those DNA tests, that some secrets are better left buried. Matt is more diplomatic about it, but I can tell he blames me too. They think I'm the villain in this story because I'm the one who pulled the pin on the grenade. But here's what I keep coming back to. I didn't create the lies, I didn't have the affair, I didn't build a family on deception. Mom did that. Dan did that. And Dad, as much as I love him, chose willful ignorance over confronting the truth. The family was already ruined. It had been ruined for years. We just didn't know it. All I did was reveal what was already there. The DNA test didn't destroy anything that wasn't already broken. It just made the cracks visible. And yeah, maybe we could have gone on pretending everything was fine, living in a comfortable lie. But at what cost? Dad deserved to know. We deserve to know. The truth matters even when it's ugly, even when it hurts, even when it tears everything apart. I don't regret buying those tests. I regret that the truth was so devastating. I regret that my family couldn't survive honesty. But I don't regret giving us the chance to live in reality instead of fiction. Even if reality means holidays spent apart and siblings who barely speak to me, at least it's real. Dan keeps trying to reach out, sends messages through Matt, leaves voicemails I never listen to. He wants forgiveness or connection or something I'll never give him. As far as I'm concerned, I have one father, and his name isn't Dan. Biology can say whatever it wants. The man who matters is the one who stayed. Workplace betrayal cuts deep too, especially when you watch someone steal your success right in front of an audience. I'd spent 6 months on this campaign. 6 months of late nights, weekend research, endless revisions, client calls that ran past midnight because of time zone differences. This wasn't just another project. It was the biggest client our agency had landed in 5 years, and leadership had specifically chosen me to lead it. I was proud of the work. It was solid, creative, exactly what the client needed. I'd poured everything I had into making it perfect. Rachel had joined our team about 3 months into the project. She was senior to me, had more years at the company, and honestly, I'd been excited to work with her at first. She had this reputation for being sharp and strategic. What I didn't know was that she'd built that reputation by taking credit for other people's work. I found that out the hard way. The presentation to the executive team and client was scheduled for a Thursday morning. The night before, Rachel messaged me asking if she could review the final deck. Said she wanted to help polish it, make sure everything was airtight before the big meeting. It seemed reasonable. She was more experienced. I figured having another set of eyes on it couldn't hurt. I sent her everything. The slide deck, my speaking notes, the research documentation, all of it. She thanked me and said she'd take a look and get back to me with feedback. I went to bed feeling prepared and confident. The meeting started at 9. I got there early, set up my laptop, made sure the presentation would run smoothly. Rachel arrived right before it started, looking polished and ready. She smiled at me, said she'd reviewed everything, and it looked great. I remember feeling grateful that she'd taken the time. Then the client and our executives filed in. Our CEO, the CMO, the head of accounts, all the people who mattered. The client brought their marketing director and VP. This was the audience I'd been preparing to present to for months. Except I didn't get to present. Rachel stood up, connected her laptop to the screen, and launched into my presentation. She used my slides, my data, my creative concepts. She even used my speaking notes, nearly word for word. I sat there in absolute shock, watching her present 6 months of my work as if she'd created it herself. The executives were nodding along, impressed. The client was engaged, asking questions that Rachel answered, using points I'd researched and written. She fielded every question smoothly because she was literally reading from my notes, and nobody questioned it. Nobody asked why I wasn't presenting. They all just assumed this was Rachel's project because she was standing at the front of the room claiming it. I wanted to interrupt, wanted to stand up and call her out right there, but I was frozen. Part of me couldn't believe this was actually happening. Part of me was calculating whether making a scene would hurt my career more than staying quiet. I'd never been in a situation like this before. I didn't know what to do. The presentation lasted 45 minutes. Rachel wrapped it up to applause. The client loved it. Our CEO called it exactly what they needed. Rachel thanked everyone and sat down looking triumphant. I felt sick, but here's the thing. I'm paranoid about my work. Always have been. I'd heard stories about people in advertising taking credit for other people's ideas, so I'd developed a habit of protecting myself. Every slide in that deck had metadata embedded showing me as the author. Every file had timestamps. I'd kept copies of every draft, every email chain, every piece of communication about the project. I'd even saved the Slack messages where leadership had assigned the project to me specifically. I'd prepared for this possibility without even realizing Rachel would be the one to make it necessary. The CEO asked if anyone else had contributed to the project before we moved to next steps. It was meant as a courtesy question, a way to acknowledge the team. Rachel started to answer, probably about to give some generic thanks to the department. I raised my hand and asked if I could share my screen for just a moment. The room went quiet. Rachel's face flickered with something. Confusion maybe, or the beginning of panic. The CEO said, "Sure, go ahead." I connected my laptop, pulled up the original files with full metadata visible, showed the timestamps dating back 6 months, pulled up the email where our CMO had assigned me as project lead, showed the Slack channel where I'd been posting updates and drafts for months, all time-stamped, all clearly from me. Then I pulled up my sent folder and showed the email from last night where I'd sent Rachel the final materials. I didn't editorialize, didn't accuse, just showed the evidence and let it speak for itself. The timeline was crystal clear. I'd created everything. Rachel had received it less than 24 hours ago. The silence in that room was deafening. Our CMO's face went from confused to furious in about 5 seconds. The CEO asked Rachel to explain. She tried. She stammered something about collaboration, about how she'd been consulting on the project, about how there must be some misunderstanding about roles. But that wasn't even the worst part. Our head of HR, who'd been sitting in on the meeting because of the client's importance, asked me quietly if this had happened before. I told her I didn't know, but that I'd heard rumors from junior team members. She nodded, made a note, and stepped out of the room. She came back 10 minutes later and asked Rachel to come with her. Rachel tried to protest, said we were in the middle of an important client meeting, but the CEO told her to go. She left. We continued the meeting without her, with me presenting the additional materials and answering questions about implementation. I found out later that HR had been getting complaints about Rachel for over a year. Junior employees who felt she took credit for their ideas but were too afraid to make formal accusations because she was senior and well-connected. My evidence, laid out so clearly with timestamps and documentation, gave them what they needed to finally act. Rachel was escorted out of the building by end of day. Fired for misconduct and violation of professional ethics. HR pulled records showing she'd done this at least 4 times before with other people's work. They'd all been too junior or too scared to fight back effectively. I just happened to be the one paranoid enough to document everything. The fallout was immediate. Leadership called an all-hands meeting to address what had happened. Apologized for not catching the pattern sooner. Promised to implement better oversight and create protected channels for reporting this kind of theft. They promoted me to Rachel's position, gave me a raise, and made it clear that protecting employees' work was a priority moving forward. The client was impressed by how we handled it. Said it showed integrity that we'd addressed the issue immediately, instead of sweeping it under the rug. They signed a contract extension. My career didn't just survive Rachel's attempted theft, it accelerated because of how I'd handled the exposure. But the thing that stuck with me most was the conversation I had with one of the junior employees afterward. She came to my office almost crying, thanking me for standing up, said Rachel had taken credit for her work on a smaller project months ago, and she'd been too scared to say anything. She'd watched me present that evidence and felt like maybe she could have done the same if she'd known to document things. I started teaching people on my team to protect their work, not because I wanted to create a culture of distrust, but because the reality of this industry is that not everyone operates with integrity. Watermark your files, keep your drafts, save your emails, document your process. It feels cynical, but it's protection. And after what happened with Rachel, nobody on my team questioned the importance of it. Looking back, the wildest part is that Rachel probably thought she'd get away with it. She'd gotten away with it before. She had no reason to think this time would be different, but she underestimated two things. First, how thoroughly I document my work, and second, how ready the company was to act once they finally had undeniable proof of what she'd been doing. I don't take satisfaction in someone losing their job, but I also don't lose sleep over it. She made a choice. She stole months of my work and presented it as her own in front of executives and clients. The consequences of that choice were hers to own. Being blamed for someone else's failures is crushing until the moment you can prove exactly who's responsible. The project had been a disaster from the start, but I never thought I'd be the one taking the fall for it. We were 3 months into what was supposed to be a 6-month rollout of a new client management system, and everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. Missed deadlines, budget overruns, features that didn't work, clients threatening to leave. It was a mess. And in the company-wide meeting where our executive team demanded answers, my manager Brandon stood up and threw me directly under the bus. He said I'd ignored warnings, that I'd missed critical deadlines, that I'd made unilateral decisions without consulting the team, that the failure of this project, which was costing the company hundreds of thousands of dollars, was fundamentally my fault as the project lead. I sat there in that conference room, watching him lie to a room full of executives and colleagues, and I felt my career crumbling in real time. People were staring at me. The VP of Operations asked if I had anything to say in my defense. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. What was I supposed to say? That my manager was lying? That he'd ignored every warning I'd given him? It sounded like exactly what someone would say when they were guilty and desperate. The meeting ended with me being told to expect a follow-up conversation with HR. Translation: I was about to be fired. I went back to my desk in a daze, packed up my things like I'd already been terminated, and went home. Sat on my couch for about 2 hours just staring at the wall, trying to process what had just happened. Then I remembered the emails. I'd kept everything, every single communication about this project from day one. I'm naturally cautious, the kind of person who documents conversations and keeps paper trails, and in this case, that habit was about to save me. I spent the entire night going through my email archives, created a folder and started pulling every relevant message, organized them chronologically. What emerged was a clear, undeniable timeline of me warning Brandon about problems and him either ignoring me or explicitly telling me to do things I knew were wrong. 2 weeks into the project, I'd sent him an email outlining resource shortages. We didn't have enough developers assigned to meet the timeline he'd promised the executives. His response was that we'd make it work, that I needed to be more of a team player and less focused on obstacles. A month in, I'd warned him that the timeline was unrealistic, given the scope changes clients kept requesting. I'd laid out 3 options: extend the deadline, reduce the scope, or add more team members. He'd responded by telling me to stop being negative and just execute the plan. 6 weeks in, I'd sent a detailed email explaining that a specific technical approach he wanted us to take wouldn't work with our existing infrastructure. I'd included research, quotes from our senior developers, alternative solutions. He'd replied with a single sentence telling me to proceed as directed. There were dozens of these. Every time I'd raised a concern, every time I'd suggested a course correction, every time I'd tried to prevent exactly the disaster that had happened, I had documentation. And in several cases, I had Brandon's explicit written instruction to do things that I'd warned him were mistakes. I requested a meeting with HR the next morning, told them I had evidence that contradicted Brandon's account of events. The HR director seemed skeptical, but agreed to bring in the executive team for a follow-up meeting that afternoon. Walking into that conference room was terrifying. Same executives who'd watched Brandon blame me the day before. Same Brandon, sitting there looking confident, probably thinking I was about to dig my hole deeper. The VP of Operations asked me to explain why I'd requested this meeting. I pulled out my printed timeline, 40 pages of emails, organized by date, highlighted for clarity. I'd created a summary document that walked through the project's key failure points and showed for each one where I'd warned Brandon and what his response had been. Then I started presenting. I showed them the email where I'd flagged resource shortages 2 weeks in, read Brandon's response out loud, showed them my follow-up a week later when the shortage was causing delays, and Brandon's reply telling me to make it work with what we had. I showed them the timeline concerns, the technical warnings, the budget issues I'd identified early, every single problem that had ultimately caused the project to fail. I documented and escalated, and every single time Brandon had either dismissed my concerns or ordered me to proceed anyway. But that wasn't even the worst part. I had emails where Brandon had explicitly told me to stop raising concerns in team meetings because it was hurting morale. Messages where he'd accused me of being too negative when I brought up legitimate risks. A particularly damning thread where I'd suggested we needed to tell the executives the project was in trouble, and he'd forbidden me from doing so, saying it would make the department look bad. The room got very quiet as I went through the evidence. Brandon tried to interrupt a few times, claiming I was taking things out of context, but the emails spoke for themselves. There was no context that made them look better for him. The VP asked Brandon directly if he'd received these warnings. He admitted he had, but claimed he'd thought I was being overly cautious, that he'd made judgment calls as the manager. The VP asked why, if Brandon had thought my concerns were invalid, he hadn't documented his reasoning or escalated the disagreement to his own superiors. Brandon didn't have a good answer for that. Then the executive team asked if anyone else on the project team could corroborate my account. I mentioned that several team members had been copied on key emails and had expressed similar concerns in private. HR said they'd follow up with those individuals. The meeting ended without any clear resolution, but the energy had shifted completely. I was no longer the obvious scapegoat. Brandon was no longer the wronged manager dealing with an incompetent employee. Now there were questions about his judgment, his leadership, his honesty. Over the next week, HR interviewed other team members. Turns out I wasn't the only one Brandon had blamed for things. There was a pattern. When projects went well, Brandon took credit. When they went poorly, he found someone else to pin it on. Multiple people came forward with their own stories of being thrown under the bus, of raising concerns that Brandon ignored, of watching him rewrite history to protect himself. Things went from bad to unhinged when one of the senior developers admitted he'd been looking for a new job, specifically because of Brandon's management style. Said he'd been in the industry 15 years and had never worked for someone so willing to sacrifice his team to save his own reputation. 2 weeks after my presentation to the executive team, Brandon was demoted, removed from his management position, and moved to an individual contributor role in a different department. I was cleared of all blame for the project failure. The VP personally apologized to me for the initial meeting where I'd been publicly blamed. They offered me a transfer to a different department, working under a director who'd apparently been impressed by my documentation and my willingness to stand up for myself. Better role, better pay, better team. I took it immediately. Brandon lasted about 2 more months at the company before he was let go entirely. Apparently his new manager wasn't impressed with his work, and HR had enough documented concerns from multiple employees that they didn't want to risk keeping him around. I ran into one of my old teammates a few months after everything went down. She told me that after I'd presented those emails, several people had started keeping better documentation of their own work, that the whole department had learned a lesson about the importance of covering yourself when you work for someone untrustworthy. Not the healthiest work environment, maybe, but a practical one. Looking back, the scariest part wasn't almost getting fired for something that wasn't my fault. It was realizing how close I came to not having the evidence to prove my innocence. If I hadn't been naturally cautious about documentation, if I'd had those conversations verbally instead of over email, if I'd trusted Brandon to remember things accurately, my career could have been destroyed based on his lies. Now I'm even more diligent about keeping records. Every important conversation gets followed up with an email summarizing what was discussed and agreed upon. Every decision gets documented. Every warning gets put in writing. It's exhausting sometimes, but it's also insurance against exactly what Brandon tried to do to me. The whole experience taught me that trust in the workplace has to be balanced with verification. You want to believe your manager has your back, that your company values honesty, that hard work and good intentions will be recognized. But sometimes none of that is true, and the only thing standing between you and an unfair termination is a well-organized email folder and the willingness to fight back. Empty promises from leadership sting worse when you discover the promotion you earned went to someone else for all the wrong reasons. I'd been working toward that promotion for 8 months. 8 months of staying late, taking on extra projects, mentoring new hires, doing everything my boss David asked and then some. Every performance review, he told me I was doing amazing work, that the senior analyst position was mine when it opened up, that I just needed to keep doing what I was doing. So I did. I believed him. The job was supposed to be officially posted in March. March came and went with David saying HR was just slow with the paperwork, not to worry. April arrived and he said they were restructuring the announcement process. By May, I was starting to get suspicious, but David was so reassuring every time I asked. He'd put his hand on my shoulder and tell me to be patient, that good things were coming, that I'd earned this. Then I was scrolling through LinkedIn one night and saw it. A post from someone in a different department congratulating David's niece on her new role as senior analyst. My role. The role I'd been promised. The role I'd been working toward for almost a year. I felt my stomach drop, refreshed the page thinking maybe I'd misread it. But no, there it was. Clear as day. I knew David had a niece working in our department. Her name was Madison. She'd started about 3 months ago, fresh out of college with a business degree and exactly zero relevant experience. I'd actually been the one training her, showing her our systems, explaining our processes, answering her endless questions. David had told me she was just a temporary hire to help with overflow work during our busy season. Temporary, that's what he'd said. Turns out temporary meant temporarily, in a junior role before getting handed my promotion. I couldn't sleep that night, kept refreshing company pages, looking for an official announcement. Nothing yet, but the LinkedIn post was real. Other people were commenting on it, congratulating Madison, talking about how lucky our team was to have her step up. Step up. She'd been there 3 months and could barely run a basic report without help. Monday morning, I got to work early. Sat in my car in the parking lot, rehearsing what I was going to say to David. I wanted to be professional, calm, not let him see how hurt and angry I was. But the second I walked into his office and saw his face, the careful speech I'd planned evaporated. I asked him point blank if he'd given the senior analyst position to Madison. He did this thing where he smiled and tried to act confused, like he didn't know what I was talking about. So I pulled up the LinkedIn post on my phone and showed him. Watched his expression shift from fake confusion to real discomfort. He stumbled through some excuse about how it was complicated, that family helping family was important, that Madison had potential and deserved a chance. I reminded him that he'd been promising me this promotion for 8 months, that I'd earned it, that I'd been doing senior level work without senior level pay for months now. He said another opportunity would come, that I was still valuable to the team, that this didn't change anything about my future with the company. It changed everything, actually, because now I knew his promises meant nothing. Now I knew that all the extra work I'd done, all the times I'd stayed late or came in early or went above and beyond, none of it mattered when he could just hand the position to a family member who hadn't earned it. I left his office and went straight to HR. I'd been keeping documentation, not because I thought I'd need it, but because I'm thorough like that. I had emails from David praising my work, performance reviews where he'd explicitly mentioned the upcoming promotion, messages where he'd told me to keep it up because the senior role was mine. I brought all of it to HR and filed a formal complaint about nepotism and broken promises. The HR rep I spoke with was sympathetic but non-committal, said she'd look into it, that these things took time, that I should try to be patient. I was so tired of being patient, but I didn't have much choice, so I went back to my desk and tried to focus on work while my brain spiraled. But that wasn't even the worst part. 2 days later, the official announcement went out. Madison was being promoted to senior analyst, effective immediately. The email praised her initiative and fresh perspective, talked about how excited the company was to see her grow in this new role. No mention of the fact that she'd been there for 3 months. No mention of the fact that she was the boss's niece. Just corporate language that made it sound like a merit-based decision. I got messages from coworkers almost immediately. Some were sympathetic, saying they'd assumed I was getting the role. Others seemed to already know about the family connection and were warning me not to make waves. One person told me to just let it go, that fighting it would only make things harder for me in the long run. I didn't let it go. HR called me in for a meeting the following week. They'd started investigating, talking to people on the team, reviewing the hiring process. Turns out Madison didn't actually meet the minimum qualifications listed in the company policy for a senior analyst role. You were supposed to have at least 3 years of relevant experience, or a combination of education and experience that equaled that. Madison had neither. She had a degree and 3 months of on-the-job training from me. The HR investigator asked if I had any evidence that David had promised me the promotion. I handed over everything I'd collected: emails, performance reviews, even a recording from a team meeting where David had mentioned my upcoming advancement in front of everyone. The investigator's expression got more serious as she reviewed each piece of documentation. 3 weeks after I filed the complaint, HR made their decision. Madison's promotion was rescinded. She was moved to an entry-level analyst role, which is where she should have been all along. David received a formal reprimand that went in his permanent file, and I got the promotion I'd earned 8 months ago. It should have felt like a victory. In a lot of ways it was, but the workplace environment became absolutely toxic after that. David barely spoke to me except when absolutely necessary. Madison shot me dirty looks every time we passed in the hallway. Other people on the team seemed divided, some supporting me for standing up for myself, others thinking I'd caused unnecessary drama by going to HR instead of just accepting how things turned out. The tension was constant and exhausting. Every meeting felt awkward. Every project assignment felt loaded with unspoken resentment. David started excluding me from decision-making conversations I used to be part of, giving important tasks to other team members while sidelining me with busy work. It was clear he was trying to push me out without actually firing me, making my work life miserable enough that I'd quit on my own. I documented all of that too, kept records of every time I was excluded, every project I was removed from, every instance of what felt like retaliation. I went back to HR multiple times, showed them the pattern. They talked to David, reminded him that retaliation was illegal, but nothing really changed. He was just more subtle about it. 6 months after getting the promotion I'd fought so hard for, I started job hunting. Found a position at a competitor company, same title, better pay, healthier work environment. Gave my 2 weeks' notice and watched David's face when I handed him my resignation letter. He tried to act disappointed, said the company would miss me, asked if there was anything he could do to make me stay. I told him no, that the damage was done, that I was moving on to a place where merit actually mattered. My last day was weirdly anticlimactic. A few co-workers took me out for lunch. Madison didn't say goodbye. David gave a generic farewell speech in a team meeting that felt hollow and obligatory. I cleared out my desk, turned in my badge, and walked out of that building feeling lighter than I had in months. I heard through the grapevine about 6 months later that David was pushed out of his position. Apparently, the hostile work environment he'd created after the whole promotion debacle had led to multiple other complaints from team members. The company finally decided he was more liability than asset and forced him into early retirement. Madison left shortly after, probably realizing she didn't have her uncle's protection anymore and wasn't actually qualified to do the work she'd been hired for. My new job is great. My boss actually means it when she praises my work and makes promises about advancement. I've already been given additional responsibilities and a raise. The team is collaborative instead of competitive. People advance based on merit instead of family connections. It's everything my old job should have been. Looking back, I'm glad I fought for that promotion, even though it made my life harder in the short term. I could have just quit when I found out about Madison, found a new job without the confrontation. But I would have always wondered if I should have stood up for myself, if I should have called out the unfairness. By going to HR, by documenting everything, by refusing to just accept the nepotism quietly, I proved to myself that I was willing to fight for what I'd earned. And when the environment became unbearable despite winning that fight, I had the self-respect to walk away instead of staying somewhere I wasn't valued. Sometimes HR exists to protect the company from scandal, not to protect you, until you make the scandal too big to contain. I'd worked at the company for 3 years when Mark became my supervisor. At first, everything seemed normal. He was friendly, professional, gave good feedback on my work. Then about 2 months in, things started to shift. Comments about my appearance that felt too personal. Compliments that lingered too long. Invitations to after-work drinks that felt less like team bonding and more like dates I hadn't agreed to. I tried to handle it myself at first, set boundaries, kept conversations professional, started documenting everything just in case. But Mark didn't take the hint. The comments got worse. He'd find excuses to stand too close to me, send messages late at night that had nothing to do with work, make jokes about us being alone in the office that made my skin crawl. One night he cornered me in the break room after everyone else had left, told me he'd noticed the tension between us and thought we should talk about it over dinner. I said there was no tension, that I was just focused on doing my job. He laughed, said I was playing hard to get, that he appreciated a challenge. Then he put his hand on my waist. I pushed past him and left. Drove home shaking so hard I almost had to pull over. That's when I decided to go to HR. I had months of inappropriate messages saved, screenshots of comments that crossed every professional line, witness statements from coworkers who'd seen him behave inappropriately. I'd been keeping records because some part of me had known this was coming. I met with the HR director, a woman named Patricia who I'd thought would take this seriously. I laid out everything. Showed her the evidence, explained the pattern of escalation, told her about the break room incident. She listened, took notes, said she'd investigate and get back to me. 2 weeks later, she called me into her office. I thought she was going to tell me Mark had been disciplined or reassigned. Instead, she offered me $15,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement and resign. Said the company valued my contributions, but that situations like this were complicated. That Mark was a high performer, brought in major clients, and that proving harassment was difficult even with evidence. She implied, without saying it directly, that fighting this would be expensive and damaging to my career. The audacity of it actually left me speechless for a moment. They weren't even pretending to care about what had happened to me. They'd done the math and decided Mark was worth protecting and I was worth paying off. $15,000. That's what they thought my dignity and safety were worth. I told Patricia I needed time to think about it. She said I had 48 hours to decide. I left her office and immediately called a lawyer. My attorney looked at everything I had and said I had a solid case. The evidence was thorough, the pattern was clear, and the company's response was textbook retaliation. But she also warned me that going public would be difficult, that companies have resources and legal teams designed to outlast individual plaintiffs, that even winning could take years and cost me professionally. I told her I understood. Then I asked her to help me compile everything into a comprehensive document. Timeline, evidence, witness statements, the whole thing. I spent a weekend writing my story, keeping it factual and careful to avoid anything that could be considered defamation. Just the truth, documented and dated. Then I posted it on LinkedIn. I wasn't naive about what would happen. I knew it was risky, but I also knew that HR was counting on me staying quiet, that the whole system was built on victims being too afraid to speak up. So I spoke up loud enough that they couldn't ignore it. The post went viral within hours. By the next morning, it had thousands of shares and comments. People were tagging the company, asking questions, demanding accountability. Then something else started happening. Other women began reaching out to me privately. Women who'd worked with Mark before. Women who'd had similar experiences and been told to keep quiet. Within 48 hours, 6 other women had come forward publicly with their own stories about Mark. Different departments, different time periods, same pattern of behavior. The company had known. They'd been settling complaints about Mark for years, paying women to leave and sign NDAs while he moved up the corporate ladder. The media picked up the story. Trade publications ran articles. Clients started calling, concerned about the company's culture and ethics. The PR nightmare that HR had been trying to avoid by offering me $15,000 had arrived anyway, except now it was 10 times worse because they'd been actively covering it up. Mark was fired within a week. Patricia, the HR director who'd tried to pay me off, was fired 3 days after that. The company released a statement about taking harassment seriously and implementing new policies. But the damage was done. They'd lost clients, their reputation was in shambles, and they were facing multiple lawsuits from the other women who'd come forward. My lawyer negotiated a settlement. I can't disclose the exact amount because of the agreement, but it was 6 figures, significantly more than the 15,000 they'd tried to buy my silence with. Part of the settlement included the company completely revising their harassment policies, implementing mandatory training, and creating an independent reporting system that didn't go through HR. But that wasn't even the worst part. As more details came out during the legal process, we discovered that Mark had been reported 8 times over 12 years. 8 different women had filed complaints. The company had settled with 5 of them. The other 3 had been managed out of their positions through poor performance reviews and restructuring. HR had a literal file documenting the pattern, and they'd chosen to protect him anyway because his sales numbers were good. The entire situation became a case study. My attorney told me that employment law professors were using my story to teach about retaliation and the importance of documentation. I started getting invited to speak at conferences about workplace advocacy. Other companies reached out asking me to consult on their harassment policies. The experience changed my career in ways I never expected. I'd thought speaking out would make me unemployable, that companies would see me as a liability. Instead, organizations that actually cared about doing the right thing saw me as someone with integrity who wouldn't stay silent about problems. I got job offers from companies that wanted people willing to speak up. The other women who came forward, we stayed in touch, created a support group of sorts. Some of them struggled with the aftermath more than others. One woman's marriage nearly ended because her husband didn't understand why she'd stayed quiet for so long. Another lost friends who thought she was being dramatic. But we had each other, and that made the hard parts bearable. Mark tried to rebuild his career. Last I heard, he was working at a much smaller company in a non-supervisory role. His LinkedIn profile doesn't mention anything after his termination from our company. The internet doesn't forget, and his name is permanently associated with the scandal. That might sound harsh, but I think about the 8 women he harassed over 12 years. I think about how many more there might have been if someone hadn't finally said enough. Patricia, the HR director, faced her own reckoning. She was named specifically in several lawsuits. Her professional reputation was destroyed. She'd built a career on protecting the company at the expense of employees, and when that strategy backfired spectacularly, nobody wanted to hire someone known for sweeping harassment under the rug. I don't regret going public. Not for a second. Yes, it was terrifying. Yes, there were moments when I wondered if I'd made a huge mistake, but staying silent would have meant letting Mark continue to hurt people. It would have meant accepting that my safety and dignity were worth $15,000 and a signature on a piece of paper designed to protect my abuser. The system is built to keep victims quiet. NDAs, settlements, the threat of career consequences, all of it is designed to make speaking up scarier than staying silent. And it works most of the time. But every now and then, someone refuses to play along. Someone decides that the truth matters more than the payoff. And when that happens, when someone shines a light on what's been happening in the dark, everything changes. I've talked to dozens of women since this happened who are dealing with similar situations. Some of them go public, some don't. I never judge either choice because I know how hard it is and how personal the decision has to be. But I always tell them the same thing. Document everything, know your rights, and remember that the people who want you to stay quiet are the ones who benefit from the silence. Betrayal from strangers is expected, but when your best friend knowingly lets you get humiliated, that's a special kind of pain. I'd been planning Tom's surprise anniversary party for 2 months. 10 years of marriage felt like something worth celebrating, so I went all out. Rented a private room at his favorite restaurant, invited 50 of our closest friends and family, coordinated with his boss to make sure he'd be free that night. I wanted it to be perfect, a room full of people who loved us, celebrating a decade of what I thought was a solid marriage. Megan was my right hand through all of it. She'd been my best friend since college, knew Tom almost as long as I had, and was genuinely excited to help. We spent hours picking out decorations, arguing about the playlist, coordinating who would bring what food. She helped me create a slideshow of photos from our relationship, laughing at the embarrassing early dating pictures and getting teary over our wedding photos. She was there for every detail, every decision, every moment of planning. The party was scheduled for a Saturday night. I told Tom we were just having a quiet dinner, the two of us, nothing fancy. He seemed fine with that, maybe even relieved. I remember thinking it was sweet that he was okay with low-key celebration. Looking back, I realized he was probably relieved because it meant less lying about where he actually wanted to be. I got to the restaurant early to set everything up. Megan was already there, directing people on where to put presents, making sure the surprise would work logistically. Guests started arriving around 6. By 6:30, the room was full. Everyone was excited, phones ready to capture Tom's reaction when he walked in. I texted Tom at 6:45 saying I was running a few minutes late, that he should just meet me at the restaurant. He said no problem, he was heading over. I stood by the door with everyone else, practically vibrating with excitement. This was going to be amazing. Tom walked in at 7 on the dot, but he wasn't alone. He had his arm around a woman I'd never seen before. They were laughing about something, completely comfortable with each other in a way that made my stomach drop, even before my brain fully processed what I was seeing. The room erupted, not with the surprise party cheer I'd been expecting, with gasps and confused murmuring and somebody's aunt saying, "Oh my God," way too loudly. Tom's face went from relaxed and happy to absolutely horrified in about half a second. The woman next to him, who I'd later learn was named Claire, looked around at the room full of people staring at them and went pale. I just stood there, couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. This was supposed to be a celebration of our marriage. Instead, I was watching my husband realize he'd just walked into a room full of our friends and family, with his girlfriend on his arm. Tom started stammering, trying to explain that Claire was a colleague, that they were just meeting up before he came to dinner with me, but nobody was buying it. You don't walk into a restaurant with your arm around a colleague looking that comfortable unless there's something going on. And the way Claire was looking at him, panicked and guilty, made it even more obvious. Then came the breaking point. My sister, who has never been one to stay quiet when something's wrong, asked Tom directly if he was having an affair. Just put it out there in front of everyone. And Tom, to his credit, or maybe just because lying was pointless at that point, admitted it. The room exploded. People were yelling, crying, demanding explanations. Tom's parents looked devastated. My parents looked furious. Friends were pulling me aside, asking if I was okay, if I knew what they could do. And I was still just standing there, watching my marriage implode in front of 50 witnesses at what was supposed to be our anniversary party. But that wasn't even the worst part. In the chaos, I heard Claire say something to Megan. Something like, "I thought you said she didn't know." I turned and looked at my best friend, who had gone completely white, and in that moment, I understood. Megan had known. She'd known about the affair and said nothing. While helping me plan this party, while laughing over decorations and coordinating guest lists, she'd known my husband was cheating on me. I asked her right there, in front of everyone, "How long have you known?" She tried to deflect, said we should talk privately, but I wasn't having it. I asked again. How? Long? 6 months. She'd known for 6 months. Claire was her co-worker. She'd seen them together at happy hours, at lunch, had put the pieces together and never said a word. She'd watched me plan this anniversary party, talk about how lucky I was to have Tom, make plans for our future, and she'd stayed silent. I asked her why. Why would she let me do this? Let me be humiliated like this in front of everyone I know? And her answer was almost worse than the betrayal itself. She said she didn't want to get involved, that she thought it was between me and Tom, that she figured he'd ended on his own, and I'd never have to know. The audacity of that reasoning honestly stunned me. She'd decided my ignorance was more important than my right to know the truth, that her comfort in not having a difficult conversation was more valuable than our friendship, than my dignity, than my ability to make informed choices about my own life. I told her we were done. Right there, in front of everyone. Told her she was no longer my friend, that I never wanted to speak to her again, that choosing to protect a cheater over being honest with me was unforgivable. She tried to apologize, said she'd made a mistake, that she'd been scared to tell me, but I was past listening. I told Tom the same thing, that our marriage was over, that he could move in with Claire for all I cared, that I'd be filing for divorce first thing Monday morning. Then I walked out of that restaurant, leaving behind the ruins of the party I'd spent 2 months planning. My sister and a few close friends followed me out. We ended up at my house drinking the expensive champagne I'd bought for the party toasts and crying on my couch while I processed what had just happened. Not just that my husband had been cheating, but that my best friend had let me walk into that disaster knowing exactly what was going to happen. The fallout was immediate and messy. Mutual friends started taking sides. Some people understood why Megan had stayed quiet, said it wasn't her place to tell me about Tom's affair, that she'd been in an impossible position. But most people, the ones who really knew me, understood that helping me plan a party while knowing my husband was cheating was a level of betrayal that went beyond staying neutral. Tom moved out within a week, moved in with Claire actually, which confirmed just how serious that relationship had been. The divorce was ugly but fast. I had no interest in dragging it out, just wanted to be done with him, to close that chapter and move on. Megan tried to reach out multiple times, long apologetic texts, voicemails explaining her thought process, even a letter delivered to my house. I never responded. What was there to say? She'd made her choice. 6 months of opportunities to tell me the truth, and she'd chosen silence every single time. The thing that hurt most wasn't even Tom's affair. Marriages end, people cheat. It's devastating, but it happens. What really broke me was Megan's betrayal. She was supposed to be my person, the one I trusted more than anyone except Tom, and she'd chosen her own comfort over my well-being. She'd watched me be humiliated in front of 50 people and had helped make it happen by staying quiet. Some of our mutual friends tried to mediate, suggested that maybe after some time I could forgive her, that everyone makes mistakes, but this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is accidentally saying the wrong thing or forgetting an important date. This was a series of deliberate choices over 6 months to prioritize not having a hard conversation over protecting someone she claimed to love. I'm 2 years out from that disaster of a party now, divorced, rebuilding my life, actually in a pretty good place considering. I've got new friends who've proven they understand what loyalty means. I'm dating someone who thinks the idea of lying to a partner is fundamentally incompatible with love. I'm okay. I saw Megan a few months ago at a mutual friend's wedding. She tried to approach me, but I just walked away. There was nothing she could say that would change what happened, nothing that would make me trust her again. She chose comfort over honesty, and that choice cost her our friendship permanently. People ask me sometimes if I regret planning that party, if I wish I'd found out about the affair some other way. Honestly, no. Yes, it was humiliating. Yes, it was the worst night of my life, but it also showed me exactly who I could trust and who I couldn't. It revealed Tom for what he was and Megan for who she'd become. Better to know the truth, even when it's devastating, than to keep living in a carefully maintained lie. The betrayal from Megan honestly hurt worse than Tom's affair. At least with Tom, once I knew he'd cheated, the relationship was clearly over. But with Megan, I kept replaying all those moments while we planned the party. Every time she'd smiled and helped pick out decorations, every time she'd reassured me that Tom loved me. Every time she'd let me talk about my marriage like it was solid, while knowing it was built on lies. That calculated deception from someone I trusted completely cut deeper than anything Tom had done. And there you have it, 15 stories of lies unraveling, secrets exposed, and people finally getting the truth they deserved, even when it hurt. These stories remind us that sometimes the most painful revelations lead to the most necessary changes. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're either a glutton for drama or someone who understands that truth, however messy, beats living in beautifully constructed lies. Sweet dreams, everyone, and remember the truth might hurt temporarily, but living a lie hurts forever. Until next time, keep your receipts, trust your gut, and never be afraid to walk away from people who choose deception over honesty. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.